of the International Federation of Therapeutic and Counselling Choice. The Church of England, which has encouraged the UK's government's ban on therapeutic choice, has a campaign which they call Valuing All God's Children. This is directed at its 4,800 schools, and according to them, valuing God's children means promoting the LGBT pressure group Stonewall. Stonewall itself has some 950 school champions promoting LGBT rights to children. Another group, Educate and Celebrate, a group also working to make LGBT visible in schools, claims that in a year they were able to meet more than 250,000 young people, their teachers and their parents. Since 2005, they claim, millions have been helped by their Pride Youth networks working to promote LGBT and other identities in classrooms everywhere in the United Kingdom. The government's LGBT Action Plan, announced earlier this year, has made £3 million available for the same purpose in some 1,200 schools in the UK. There is no doubt then that children and young people are being targeted to embrace an ideology of sexuality that ignores biology and scientific fact. Banning therapeutic choice is designed to entrench these ideologies. Our speakers today represent a position that reminds us of our creation, calls us back to our biology, critiques these ideologies, and offers protection to parents and the young from these destructive pathways. The International Federation for Therapeutic and Counselling Choice, which we launched today with our allies in different nations, is a new opportunity for those who will no longer be forced to support these destructive trends and to work with us to promote a better, safer way. Thank you for joining us today, and we welcome especially Dr. Quinton van Meter, Dr. Crystal van Holt, Dr. Laura Haynes. But before our first speaker, Dr. Karis Mosley, comes, let me share with you something of why we are launching the IFTCC today. In 2015, following a conference in Germany, like-minded people from a range of countries in Western, Eastern Europe, and the USA agreed to establish what today we call the International Federation for Therapeutic and Counselling Choice. Since 2015, conferences have been held annually in Europe, and our participant numbers continue to grow from more than 21 nations. In 2017, we formally registered the home of the IFTCC in Great Britain, and it's my privilege now to welcome you to the official website for this organization. But the IFTCC is more than an organization. It's a movement of people who are coming together, holding on to ethical values and an understanding of sexuality, marriage and family, inspired by Judeo-Christian values. Pansexual humanism is fast becoming the preferred driver of values in Western nations and is swiftly making inroads into other world areas. Pansexuality promotes and normalizes sexual expression irrespective of gender boundaries and conflates sexual and gender fluidity. The result is confusion and frightening sexual anarchy. The normalization of homosexuality has led the way in this, and sadly, as these practices take root, marriage declines, and birth rates in these nations are falling. One of the consequences of this is that we're increasingly finding that we live in monocultures of political orthodoxy in which diversity of viewpoint is not tolerated. Viewpoint discrimination is the result. Those celebrating male and female gender roles, marriage, and the nuclear family are finding themselves increasingly under pressure to conform to this new political orthodoxy. Without competing viewpoints and diverse perspectives, being free to speak and to contend for truth, democracies suffer and totalitarianisms take root. Mandatory or the must-stay gay culture also refuses to allow competing viewpoints. This is why there is now a determination to ban any and all initiatives that offer counseling or therapeutic support for those wanting to come out of homosexual practices and feelings. The IFTCC is here to support the rights and freedoms of those who are experiencing unwanted same-sex and gender confusions, who are unwilling to be forced into counseling approaches that are simply gay-affirming and offer no alternatives. We're a multidisciplinary group led by an executive board, a range of advisory councils and country representatives in different world regions. We aim to offer online, borderless training that enables us to establish a list of preferred provider counselors to recommend to those seeking help. These are counselors and other professionals who have met minimum standards to be able to deliver ethically based, effective support for those coming out of homosexuality and gender confusions. We hope you find the site useful and a point of contact to meet others from all over the world who have found help or who offer support. We aim to be transparent, accountable, and professional in what we do, and your support will help us to do exactly that. Thanks for visiting us today. It's a very great pleasure for me today to welcome and to introduce Dr. Karis Mosley, who's going to come in a minute. Karis studied classics at the University of Cambridge and theology at the universities of Oxford and Edinburgh. She held a research post in academic theology at Edinburgh, where she also taught Christian theology and ethics. She currently works in public policy research in the at Christian Concern in the United Kingdom. She's contributed to the IFTCC response document, which we hope to make available to you and which is online and which is available on the homepage right now if you'd like to check it out. And she's going to lead us through the document. But before she comes, take a look at this event that we held last year in Slovakia. This was our third IFTCC conference.
Good afternoon. I'm very honoured to be here to speak on behalf of Christian Concern, and I'm a public policy research analyst for them. It seems strange that the topic of psychotherapy should have become a matter for public policy. But this is why I'm here, of course, to shed some light on the history and ethics around this therapy, as we try to do in the document that you can see before you and that's online. So we're going to start by talking about the therapeutic tradition in the United Kingdom, and I make a hint of that in the document. Psychotherapy for unwanted same-sex attraction and gender confusion has been practiced in the United Kingdom for a century or so now, with varying levels of success. That's not very well known. It's certainly true that case studies have been recorded, and I shall say a little more about this matter later. Several of the most eminent and respected therapists have been involved at one time or another in this work. I've been looking into the evidence, and I'm working on writing a historical account of treatment, with special attention to the philosophical and moral issues involved. It's fair to call psychotherapy not only a discipline, but a secular tradition by now, with its own major thinkers, practitioners, and also critics. It has become important for Christians working in pastoral work, whether as ordained or lay persons, to have some acquaintance with this field. Though often this is more via learning counseling skills. The relationship between Christian theology and psychotherapy and psychology has not always been an easy one. At present, the relationship of psychotherapy with reality has been stretched to breaking point in the United Kingdom, thanks to the publication of the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapies, signed by most major mental health bodies, as well as by NHS England and NHS Scotland. The memorandum bans not only all therapy to reduce same-sex attraction and increase heterosexual attraction, regardless of the client's wishes and also without regard for age. It also bans all therapy aimed at helping clients who experience any degree of transgender identification to live in harmony with their biological sex. The words man and woman and male and female no longer mean anything to most mental health bodies in the UK, and as such, psychotherapy for sexual problems has become incoherent. It really is the case that the time of the International Federation for Therapeutic and Counselling Choice has come. Did you know, for example, that the UK Council for Psychotherapy, one of the first to sign up to the memorandum, announced as far back as 2010 that we do not know how either heterosexuality or homosexuality originates. This was in response to unspecified comments about the memorandum, banning professional members from offering this kind of therapy. This really is an insult to the intelligence, a serious blow to the credibility of the professional body in question. Now, the government is supporting a ban, having first said so via the LGBT news site Pink News, which reported in March this year that the Home Office was considering a ban. I don't think that was a coincidence. It was soon after Voices of the Silenced. It was screened. And I also wrote an article for Christian Concern talking about the research that Mike had made on public opinion, that it didn't support a ban. Our opponents read what we put out there. They know that people can change and move away from same-sex attraction and behavior. They know there is evidence for this. Their only weapon, therefore, is censorship and intimidation tactics. It's one thing for LGBT campaigners to insist on a ban. They've been doing this for 50 years. It's quite another thing for the present government to be so cowardly as to actually give in to their demands. In proposing a ban on therapy, the UK government has ripped up the moral compromise between the vast majority of people who disapproved of same-sex relations and were concerned about the effect on people, and those who tolerated and even approved them. And that compromise was in the Wolfenden Report of 1957, and it was put on a statutory footing by the Sexual Offences Act of 1967. The fact of the matter is that the Wolfenden Report's recommendation of the decriminalisation of homosexual acts between consenting adult men over the age of 21 was in fact predicated upon acceptance of the therapeutic treatment of homosexuality. Of the witnesses who appeared before the Wolfenden Committee, the psychotherapists were in favour of decriminalisation, but most other witnesses, including criminal justice professionals, were not. And the Conservative government of the day was not in favour, and neither was the public. The archives of the Wolfenden Committee, which are available in the National Archives in Kew, and I've been looking through those, clearly show that therapists, as well as psychiatrists, were asked a lot of questions about change, okay? And they were able to answer affirmatively in varying degrees. So here's some of the evidence, and this is in the document. The witnesses were among the most eminent and well-regarded in the psychological professions in their day in Britain. They included people who talked about their own clients, of course. So H.V. Dix from the Tavistock Clinic, John Kellner from the Tavistock Clinic, Clifford Allen, Eustace Chesser, T.C.N. Gibbons from the Institute of Psychiatry, William Gillespie from the Institute of Psychoanalysis, Elliot Jacques from the Institute of Psychoanalysis, Wilfred Byron from the London Clinic of Psychoanalysis, a Dr. Harris from the Royal Medico-Psychological Society, which is actually now the Royal College of Psychiatry, and a Dr. Hobson from the same society, and Winifred Rushforth from the Davidson Clinic in Edinburgh. 60 years later, the UK government is unwilling to listen to any practitioners in psychotherapy dealing with these issues or their supporters, having chosen instead only to listen to gay male activists preoccupied with criminalizing therapy. This is despite the fact that there is evidence for the benefit being published internationally. So if we turn to the survey, there's a disingenuous definition of conversion therapies, okay? Section 5.7, so-called conversion therapies, sometimes also referred to as cure, aversion, or reparative therapies, are techniques intended to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. These techniques can take many forms and commonly range from pseudo-psychological treatments to spiritual counseling. In extreme cases, they may also include surgical and hormonal interventions, or even so-called corrective rape. Respondents were asked whether they had ever undergone or been offered any such intervention, and if so, who had conducted or offered it. This was said in the report after the survey, okay? Now there's a discrepancy between the report on the survey and the original questionnaire. The questionnaire has been published in Annex 2 of the report. It doesn't define conversion therapy in this way. It doesn't claim that surgical and hormonal treatments or corrective rape are types of therapy. Questions 142 to 145 if you want to go into the questionnaire. Such a discrepancy between the content of survey questions for members of the public and the content of the official report based on the responses is disturbingly unempirical and ethically unacceptable. It suggests that respondents were misled as to the true motivations of the government in asking such questions. But when the survey opened in July 2017, the government had not stated that it would ban therapy for unwanted same-sex attraction. By the way, I also made a Freedom of Information request to the Government Equalities Office about this business of corrective rape. I asked specifically, did they have any evidence that a therapist working on sexuality in the United Kingdom had ever recommended this as treatment? And under the Freedom of Information law, they had to reply to me, and they admitted that they had not. So effectively, they were lying, and this was said in Parliament, and therefore Parliament was arguably misled, because the jurisdiction of any law that would be passed on this could only extend across the United Kingdom, and if there are no cases of what they're talking about, it's irrelevant. Also, most former clients were non-religious, and this is very important because we're an eclectic collection of people. There is a table in the survey report indicating the religion or belief of respondents who said they had therapy. Although the table showed that Muslim and Hindu respondents were the most likely to have had therapy, and you check them against population stats, the single largest group were those of no religion, 1.5% of the non-religious respondents. And this was then followed by Christians. Okay, and remember that official statistics show religion in terms of affiliation only, which is very loose, it's a cultural attachment to religion. Now this is interesting. It echoes the findings of a well-known paper published in 2009 by 3 gay activists, which found that only 7% of clients were reported to be primarily motivated by religious concerns. Okay? Most are motivated by intrinsic concerns, with confusion about sexual orientation at the top of the list, 57%. And also, only 15% of that sample were motivated by social pressures, including family. This scuppers the claim that therapy is inherently coercive. All in all, it's fair to say that ex-gays are presumed non-existent. Okay? So when the survey asked people's sexual orientation and gender identity, it provided no tick box option for ex-gay, even though many clients who have undergone therapy due to being due to being unhappy, would subsequently call themselves ex-gays. So much about the survey. I want to move on to the human rights dimension. Or the triumph of legalism, but I'll go from that into the human rights dimension. Unless we've skipped. Right, that's fine, that is not a problem. You'll see on the next slide, there's a photo of Sir David Maxwell Fyfe. You'll see why he's relevant. He was the Home Secretary who commissioned the Wolfenden Report in 1954, and Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister. Maxwell Fyfe, as is well known, was deeply concerned about the blackmailing of homosexual men close to the government by the KGB. He had already had a distinguished legal career, having been one of the judges in the Nuremberg trials. As a result of this, he helped draft the European Convention on Human Rights, which was published in 1951, and to which the United Kingdom is a signatory. Unfortunately, due to a combination of strategic litigation by progressive activists and judicial activism by irresponsible members of the legal profession, often judges, the meaning of several of the articles of the Convention have been seriously distorted during the past quarter century. Nevertheless, the Convention has been enshrined in our laws in the Human Rights Act, and as such, it is vital to make use of it, interpret it properly, to defend this field of therapy from any and every possible attack on all sides. It is deeply ironic that it is the Home Office, albeit under the watch of Amber Rudd at the time, who was no longer Home Secretary, that was said to favour a ban. We do not know the views of the present Home Secretary on the matter. Now to this point about the triumph of legalism. Of course, the therapy consists of talking, so it cannot be a hate crime, because for something to be a hate crime, it has to be a violent crime. But it could be maliciously reported as a hate incident by opponents. In the world of hate crime studies and the sort of vagueness that's been created, disagreement and disapproval can be interpreted as hate. And telling the truth about who is male or female can also be interpreted as hate in today's climate. This nonsense is allowed to continue because not enough people really understand this distinction between hate crime and hate speech, and so it's permeated the public sphere. But also because hate crime laws and their legacy have represented the triumph of legalism in the Western world. Legalism here means the attempt to legislate about how people feel or should feel about certain things. Homosexuality and transsexualism or transgenderism is my topic today. The problem with legalism is that it attempts to punish thoughts rather than only actions. It also introduces inequality before the law by giving harsher penalties to criminals depending on the characteristics of their victims. This is supposed to be an educational deterrent to criminals not to attack certain kinds of people by using certain kinds of words. Of course, this doesn't really work. Hardened criminals of the sort who actually violently attack others don't really care about the niceties of language. The real purpose of this concept of hate crime and hate incident and hate speech is to criminalize objections to homosexual lifestyle, even compassionate and critical ones. All this bullying thinking has been incorporated into the counter-extremism strategy of the government. But before I discuss that, I'll go into more detail on the human rights dimension. So there's Maxwell Fyfe for you. The proposed ban on counselling and therapy would, in our view, a Christian concern, violate the European Convention on Human Rights. It would be a sex discrimination, violation of Article 14. Why? We're thinking about transgenderism for a minute. For someone to go down that path of an alternative gender identity means moving away from living and being known as a member of their sex. The Memorandum of Understanding, as I said earlier, imposes no lower age limit on clients, so it's a threat to vulnerable and impressionable children and teenagers, as well as to vulnerable adults, including those with undiagnosed psychiatric conditions and learning difficulties. Such people could be manipulated and are manipulated into a transgender or non-binary identification, and as such have their sex-based dignity and rights violated. Discrimination against ex-LGBT people, ex-gays, detransitioners, whatever term you want to use, a violation of Article 14 under other status. Thanks to the legal casework of the Christian Legal Centre, on behalf of Core Issues Trust, ex-gay is a protected characteristic in the common law under the Equality Act of 2010. And you could say that is a sexual identity, meaning it's a social descriptor used by the individual concerning him or herself as regards leaving behind gay or lesbian identity, traction, and behaviour. It's also obviously an attack on freedom of speech to try to ban therapy, a violation of Article 9 on freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Therapeutic conversations are private and confidential, though may occur either in the public sector or the private sector. Banning therapy would violate freedom of speech of both clients and therapists, as well as third parties such as supervisors of therapists. It's an attack on freedom of expression, violation of Article 10. Restriction on therapy would count as an attack on freedom of expression of the individual client, the counsellor or therapist, his or her supervisor, any course lecturers, tutors or facilitators, the freedom of expression of family members of the client if they came for couple therapy or family therapy. Also under Article 10, an attack on academic freedom, which is the freedom to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. A ban on therapy would erode academic freedom regarding this entire field, affecting researchers, educationalists, and students. It would be an attack on freedom of assembly and association, Article 11. Restriction of therapy is an attack on the freedom of assembly, including organisation of conferences such as this one, training events, group therapy, educational events, press conferences, showings of films and plays. We've already seen that with Voices of the Silenced. It would be an attack on freedom of conscience, returning to Article 9. Many people choose to seek therapy to move away from LGBT identification for reasons of conscience. Remember, I mentioned non-religious clients. Many professionals in this field are also following their conscience in providing such services. An attack on the right to respect for private and family life, according to Article 8. Now, the original intent of the right to respect for private and family life was to protect the individual from unwarranted state surveillance. Many counsellors and therapists work from their own homes, and they may be self-employed. Other therapists may work over the internet or the telephone or use email. In order to be effective, a ban on counselling and psychotherapy would have to entail restrictions on therapists' use of the internet, phone, and all other means of electronic and remote communication, as well as interference with these to detect therapeutic activity. The UK Council for Psychotherapy says on its website that if members of the public are aware that conversion therapy is taking place, they should make a complaint. Members of the public are asked to snitch on private conversations about sex. This is insane. This is unacceptable. It's an attack on the right to marry, Article 12. Some people want therapy in order to feel they're ready to pursue their personal life goal of marriage. As such, any restriction on therapies for unwanted same-sex attraction and gender identities would constitute a violation of the client's right to marry, and it could affect things like marriage preparation. Attack on religious freedom, Article 9. Some clients belong or are affiliated to a religion. Their religious beliefs and commitments may be of help to them with these intrinsic desires in moving out of former identities they no longer want, or in stopping them from moving in. And they may seek out professionals who are willing to respect their religious commitment in the therapeutic relationship. Is this therapy non-violent extremism? If you read Christian Concerns' website, you'll have seen that I've written on this. And I think it's important that I just finish by talking about this, okay? The very fact that the Home Office was said to consider a ban made it very clear that therapy was now possibly considered as a form of extremism, for the Home Office is responsible for the counter-extremism strategy, and of course hate crime comes under that. This bright idea was hatched by Theresa May in her role as Home Secretary and launched on the 19th of October 2015. Speaking at the Pink News Awards on the 27th of October 2015, Nicky Morgan, then Education Secretary, demanded that, quote, gay cure therapy, as she calls it, should be stamped out. In the same breath, she said that the Prime Minister promised to, quote, do more to tackle non-violent extremism that encourages intolerance and hatred towards LGBT people. Remember that this speech was delivered barely a week after the government launched the strategy. Then we have the Casey Review on Integration, Dame Louise Casey, neither a therapist nor a clergy person or a theologian. She published a review in December 2016 and clearly framed traditional attitudes to various things such as homosexuality as extremist and as opposed to British values. For example, I quote, "There is evidence that some people, in particular ethnic and faith communities, have views around lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people that are at odds with the mainstream modern British values and laws. Such views are frequently ascribed to more hardline and extreme individuals in those communities." Then she says, "There are examples of inequality and intolerance in other ethnic and faith groups, with concerns expressed to us during the review about newer Christian churches, with activists seeking to, quote, cure people of homosexuality. All such instances undermine integration and should be challenged." So by that token, the Wolfenden report was extremist. The Commission for Countering Extremism, a few weeks ago, was looking for victims of extremism. On the 20th of September this year, the Commission published the terms of reference for its study on extremism and how to challenge extremism more effectively. Well, good luck with that, because there isn't one single definition of it, but never mind. Don't let the facts get away for good argument. Alongside victims of terrorism, the Commission claimed that there are other victims of extremism as follows. And it says, "We heard about gay people forced to choose between living their lives as they want and their faith, and suffering abuse as a result, and the abuse faced by people countering extremism affecting their emotional and psychological well-being. Given that Nicky Morgan and Louise Casey both attacked what they call gay cure as extremism, it is reasonable to suppose that it is a covert reference to it here in the Commission's statement. It doesn't matter that counsellors and therapists do not and cannot force anybody to do anything or say anything, nor they do not consider homosexuality a mental illness. So you can't say cure. Government propaganda is clearly built upon the assumption that everybody who encounters counselling and therapy for unwanted same-sex attraction must be somebody who actually willingly claims an LGBT identity. The difference between attraction and identity, right? The government, therefore, deliberately denies the very existence of ex-gays once again. So there we have it. The present government clearly considers this therapy to be a form of extremism, but never quite get round to saying just that. The truth is that this represents a complete moral inversion as regards the therapeutic tradition in the United Kingdom. For let's remember that psychoanalytic psychotherapy, the original form of psychotherapy, started with Jews in Vienna, secularized, assimilated Jewish people at the turn of the 20th century, and spread to London in the 1920s. In 1938, Sigmund Freud, his daughter Anna Freud, and several other prominent Jewish psychotherapists had to flee the Nazi regime in Germany and Austria. They came to London and they came to New York in the USA. Many of these treated clients with unwanted same-sex attraction. Their contributions were key to the field. They've been written up. Indeed, one of the witnesses before the Wolfenden Committee was also an expert on totalitarian regimes in Europe, what today might be called political extremism. But I'll finish with one piece of good news, given that we're dealing also with gender identity problems. Penny Mordaunt, who is the Minister for Women and Equalities, had actually repeated this nonsense about corrective rape to Parliament. She's now being forced to backtrack on her prior enthusiasm for making gender change easier. And that was this weekend. Okay? And she had been quoted a few days earlier in the press talking about extremists on both sides, but that issue as well. Again, the rhetoric of extremism is being used. And it means anybody who criticizes the government. Okay? But most people don't want to be made to lie or to deceive others or to hide deep concerns about sexuality and sexual embodiment. And so to round off, I'd like to say the International Federation exists to help people with all these problems with same-sex attraction and gender identity. And the best remedy to a threat to free speech, such as a clearly malicious one that we are facing, is to continue to speak out, speak with each other, speak to the government, speak to society. So long live the IFTCC.
Many people believe that sexual orientation is a fixed and unchangeable category of existence, and for them, any professional or pastoral initiative to support people leaving homosexual behaviors and feelings is both dangerous and harmful. Yet, ask them for the evidence of peer-reviewed research and scholarship that shows categorically that on average such interventions are harmful, and your request will be met with silence, because it simply doesn't exist. The attempt to close down professional therapeutic and counseling work, which takes seriously the goals of autonomous individuals seeking to get out of homosexual practices, means that once a person identifies as gay, there is no way of leaving either the identity or the lifestyle. This means that now gay is mandatory, and once a person decides to go in that direction, they must stay gay, in spite of the fact that science shows that sexuality is fluid and changeable. The interview that follows has an important bearing on this subject.
People are being deprived of valuable information. Like I said, not always covertly or overtly, but covertly through some of these influences. And it's also very true, and it's very unfortunate that research research is not occurring that could be coming from a different point of view that might shed light on the subject matter, like sexual orientation change. We're never going to get to that unless we have people that are able, and researchers and scientists that are able to answer questions and frame the research problem and look at the data and bring to it different values and morals, because that will affect the interpretation oftentimes.
If you'd like to hear the full interview, go to voicesofthesilence.tv. Subscribe at no cost to access all the interviews of those who are coming out of homosexual practices and those who support them. And don't forget to buy our DVD, Voices of the Silence, Part 1. It's a very great privilege now for me to welcome Dr. Laura Haynes, who is a California licensed psychologist with over 40 years clinical experience of a very practical nature. She's an author, reviews peer-reviewed journals. She serves as chair of the Research and Legislative Policy for the National Task Force for Therapy Equality. She's a consultant for the American College of Pediatricians and a member of the Research Committee for the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity, or formerly NARTH. She's a former regional president of the Christian Association for Psychological Studies and a current member of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Haynes has lobbied and testified before legislative committee hearings in several states in the USA on behalf of individuals who have unwanted sexual or gender variations. Please join with me and give a hand for Dr. Laura Haynes. Laura, before you do that, join with me and look at this event that took place last year. This was our most recent event in Slovakia.
Everyone has the right to walk away from sexual practices and experiences that don't work for them and to have support to do it. Here are 4 common reasons why people want to resolve their unwanted same-sex attractions, as expressed by Dr. Joseph Nicolosi, Jr., leading integrative therapist. Reason for therapy number 1, some men and women adopted a gay identity and had gay experiences, but they ultimately found it unfulfilling for themselves. They, not the state, should decide their sexuality. A therapy ban promoted by politicians and gay activists and professional organizations demands they must stay gay, micromanaging their sexuality for them. The Royal College of Psychiatrists wants to forbid them treatment because the college says their dissatisfaction with their sexuality is not a disorder. The Royal College says the provision of any intervention purporting to treat something which is not a disorder is wholly unethical. Really? Marital dissatisfaction is not a mental disorder. Does the Royal College of Psychiatrists consider marriage counseling unethical? How about counseling for bereavement or employment dissatisfaction? In fact, 10 UK professional organizations, including the Royal College itself, admit they approve of treatment for these matters, which are not disorders. Dissatisfaction, not only disorder, is an ethical basis for counseling. People have the right to walk away from sexual experiences they found unfulfilling and have help to do so. Reason for therapy number 2. Some individuals were sexually abused when they were young, resulting in conflict, confusion, and unwanted same-sex attractions they wish to resolve. They're not alone. In a statement in 2014, the American Psychological Association, the largest psychological association in the world, agreed that indeed people with unwanted sexual attractions may have developed these attractions as a result of childhood sexual abuse. A number of professional organizations in the UK and US take the position that same-sex orientation is normal and not a disorder. However, the American Psychological Association is now not consistent with that view. It says in the APA Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology that no gay gene has been found. Same-sex attraction is not simply biologically caused, like skin color. Psychological causes are always present, and childhood sexual abuse may lead to having same-sex partners. It based this conclusion on its review of research that included a 30-year study of documented cases of childhood sexual abuse. Here's a picture of my copy of the APA Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology. It's 2 volumes. In the series preference in the front of this handbook, the American Psychological Association gives its imprimatur to the handbook and declares it authoritative. There is no question the American Psychological Association considers this handbook authoritative. Here's the paragraph where the APA Handbook praises the rigor of the 30-year study of documented cases of childhood sexual abuse. And the handbook says there are associative and potentially causal links between childhood sexual abuse and having same-sex partners. Of course, not everyone who is gay was sexually abused, and not everyone who is sexually abused becomes gay, and some people were sexually abused after they experienced same-sex feelings or behavior. But some people do feel their same-sex attractions and behavior were forced on them by childhood sexual abuse. Feelings and behaviors forced on victims of childhood sexual abuse are a clinical and ethical reason to treat. We have evidence-based treatments for sexual abuse and for attachment feelings that victims may feel towards perpetrators. A therapy ban mandates counselors to affirm or be neutral about a client's same-sex feelings and behaviors forced on the client by sexual abuse trauma. This is hurtful. Is it more compassionate to help victims change these attractions, feelings, or behaviors they don't want, or to just give them coping methods to go on living with them? Affirming feelings and behaviors of victims caused by trauma and neglecting treatment can lead to persisting psychological disorders, health disparities, other long-term consequences for the victims' lives, and increased risk for suicide. Elizabeth Wanning, co-founder of the Christian Equipped to Love Ministry in California, told senators she lived openly as a lesbian while in seminary and as a pastor advanced the gay-affirming church movement. But a perspective-altering encounter with Jesus, in addition to unaddressed sexual abuse as a child and young adult, pressed Wanning into therapy. None of the secular counseling I received removed the trauma of these experiences, she said. By affirming my sexuality as a lesbian, that counseling never delved under the surface of judgments and agreements that empowered the comfort I felt in the arms of another woman. My faith did. By blocking access to goods and services that question sexuality, Wanning told senators, women with #MeToo experiences such as mine may never find resolution. Victims of sexual feelings or behaviors caused by trauma should have the right to heal. Reason for therapy number 3. There are people whose ethics and beliefs tell them they were created heterosexual. Everyone's personal beliefs and decisions should be respected as their right. For example, many Jews, Christians, Buddhists, and Muslims believe they were created heterosexual. Respect for the tenets of these beliefs means these individuals have the freedom to pursue the life and goals they choose for themselves. The Royal College of Psychiatrists says, the college holds the view that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people have exactly similar rights and responsibilities as all other citizens. This includes freedom to practice religion. Some desire therapy or faith-based resources to help to love according to their faith and to practice their religion. In the UK, and the National LGBT Survey labeled Faith Organization Group as the #1 provider by far of so-called conversion therapy, and parent, guardian, or family member as the 3rd greatest provider because they practice their religious beliefs. Will politicians take away freedom to practice religion from organizations, families, and those who seek their help? Will they take children from parents or guardians? These acts are already being attempted or done in some places in the United States and Canada. In the US, Sam Brinton, a national spokesperson for therapy bans, told a meeting of Google employees that the true purpose of therapy bans is not to be narrowly tailored to go after licensed professional therapists. Rather, going after professional therapists is a proxy for going after every pastor. Samantha Ames, author of Therapy Ban Bills in the US, can be heard off camera affirming that Brinton expressed that correctly. Here's the link. And by the way, all my slides are going to be made available at the IFTCC website. What we have seen in the US is that therapy bans are just the first step toward banning freedom of religious speech for pastors, churches, schools, other faith-based organizations, and in some cases, parents. When we saw that, it was a turning point for activism by leaders of traditional faith. See how pastors and Californians organized by going to ab2943.org. And what you see there, by the way, was almost entirely created since March of this year. Don't wait. Organize and act now. Therapy bans are a tax on religion. No one should take away anyone's freedom and right to live and love according to their faith and beliefs. Politicians should not go after pastors, churches, and families. Reason for therapy number 4. Some are in opposite-sex relationships with a spouse and children they love, and they want help not to stray in order to save their family and be full-time moms and dads. Under a therapy ban, there will be marriages and families that can't be saved. If a middle-aged 40-year-old mother of 3 says to a therapist, "I love my husband and children, but recently I have felt attracted to someone else. Please help me decrease my attraction to the other person." And if the other person is a man, a therapist can help her. But if the other person is a woman, a therapy ban requires the therapist to refuse. Could she even talk to her pastor or family member for help? Do these same-sex attracted people in relationships with the opposite sex represent a very common situation? The Royal College of Psychiatrists said, "Nevertheless, sexual orientation for most people seems to be set around a point that is largely heterosexual or homosexual." That appears to say most people with same-sex sexuality are set around same-sex relationships. But the American College Psychological Association says, and international research shows, most people who experience same-sex attraction also experience equal or greater opposite-sex attraction. The APA handbook says, hence, directly contrary to conventional wisdom, individuals with non-exclusive patterns of attraction are indisputably the norm, and those with exclusive same-sex attractions are the exception. This pattern has been found internationally. Rigorous research found the second largest identity group, mostly heterosexual, was larger than all the other non-homosexual identities combined. Over time, more bisexual and mostly heterosexual identified young adults of both sexes moved toward heterosexuality than toward homosexuality, so we know they can change. Many same-sex attracted people are in opposite-sex relationships because they prefer to be. A new peer-reviewed study found therapy safe and effective. Most of these middle-aged men who were in the study are married to women and are fathers. Note that even a shift of 1 or 2 steps along the scale from homosexual to mostly homosexual to bisexual to mostly heterosexual to heterosexual can help some live in an opposite-sex relationship or be celibate as they desire. In this study, 68% experienced some to much decrease in same-sex attraction and behavior and increase in opposite-sex attraction and behavior. The authors note this was comparable to the effectiveness rates of psychotherapy in general for what counseling people received for unwanted problems, and they were better off than 70% to 75% of the persons who did not receive counseling. 18% of the men in this study experienced heterosexual attraction for the first time, and 14% changed completely from exclusive same-sex attraction to exclusive opposite-sex attraction. They experienced marked improvements in self-esteem, social functioning, self-harm, depression and suicidality, and extreme improvement in substance abuse. Most of these middle-aged men who were in this project were fathers, and now they can live as they choose and go on being full-time dads. Gay affirmative therapy is permanently unacceptable to them on religious grounds. A therapy ban would have taken away their right to this safe and effective change-allowing therapy. Under a therapy ban, there will be marriages and families that can't be saved. Both sex-attracted spouses in opposite-sex relationships are common. People who are looking for change should have the same freedom and right as everyone else to leave sexual practices and experiences that are unfulfilling for them, to heal feelings and behaviors caused by trauma, to live in love according to their faith, and to save their marriage and family. No one should take these rights away from them. The UK Government Equalities Office said in its national LGBT survey, this government is committed to making the UK a country that works for everyone. The UK today is a diverse and tolerant society. Is the UK Government Equalities Office committed to and tolerant of the diversity of these people who want to change their sexual attractions? A law that takes away people's freedoms and rights to pursue the sexual orientation of their choice, love who they want, identify as they choose, and live consistently with their faith, harms and stigmatizes them. Here are some more examples of harms that will come from a therapy ban. Attraction to engage in some illegal sexual behaviors could not be treated. Illegal behaviors, such as sexual behavior with children, might be addressed, but the attraction to engage in those behaviors could be treated only if the behaviors are directed toward the opposite sex, not same sex. An example is therapists could help a man change his sexual attraction if he desires 5-year-old girls, but not 5-year-old boys. This is dangerous. A therapy ban might even forbid helping someone change same-sex behavior unless it is illegal. Even though professional organizations agree people can change same-sex behavior. If a law recognizes therapy can change illegal same-sex behavior and allows it, will it allow this change for everyone? Sexual politics micromanages people's sexual behavior. Therapists will be required to discriminate against clients based on sexual orientation. Many kinds of symptoms and recognized disorders, from unwanted emotional and sexual ties that a sexual abuse victim may experience toward an abuser, to desire to have sex with minors, to compulsive sexual thoughts, to pornography addiction or sexual addiction, and more, could be treated only if directed toward the opposite, not same sex. Therapy bans empower social pressure and bullying against questioning individuals. Some gay men and lesbians come to experience opposite sex attraction through life experience, transformative spiritual experience, or counseling. But LGBT communities can exert strong, overt social pressure or bullying against change. Yet some change. A therapy ban is intense social pressure and bullying. Opponents of change-allowing therapy regularly show ignorance of what we do and grotesquely misrepresent it. Opponents frequently equate conversion therapy with reparative therapy, revealing their ignorance. Conversion therapy is an intentionally ill-defined term opponents use to mix everything together that they want: therapists, pastors, grandma. It is so ill-defined that it is questionable whether therapists would clearly know what they are not supposed to do so they can comply. If a therapist does not try to change a client's sexual orientation, but it changes during therapy, could the therapist be in danger? The United States Patent and Trademark Office accurately defines what reparative therapy actually is. Mental health therapy services, namely voluntary psychotherapy for individuals seeking to explore underlying psychodynamic factors which have led to the development of unwanted same-sex attractions, in which treatment interventions are directed toward resolution of underlying gender-related traumas reported by the client using evidence-based treatment interventions. The APA handbook affirmed same-sex sexual orientation is caused by psychoanalytic factors and may be caused by sexual abuse trauma. The APA handbook affirms same-sex sexual orientation is caused by psychoanalytic factors. It says, biological explanations, however, do not entirely explain sexual orientation. Psychoanalytic contingencies are evidenced as main effects or in interaction with biological factors. A joint program of research by psychoanalysts and biologically oriented scientists may prove fruitful. Change-allowing therapy today uses evidence-based treatments for trauma and sexual addictions and well-established practices used in clinics around the world. Is supported by several U.S. professional organizations. Does not try to change sexual orientation or gender identity. Does not guarantee change. Changes are byproducts of client-directed therapy. These are professional organizations in the U.S. that support change-allowing therapy, and I'm giving you these links, which will be available with my slides on the IFTCC website. Professional organizations regularly misrepresent what change-allowing therapists do in their statements that are typically talking points by gay activist professionals who do not dialogue with clinicians or researchers of change-allowing therapy. They show ignorance of actual common reasons people want change, show ignorance of current methods, have no science that meets standards to back their allegations, and are often based on views outdated by current research. UK documents opposing change-allowing therapy frequently cite the American Psychological Association Task Force Report of 2009. I have been a member of the American Psychological Association for nearly 40 years. The APA Task Force Chair refused expert change-allowing clinicians and researchers who offered to serve on the task force. I am a first-hand witness to this. I personally wrote a letter to the chair of the task force asking her to include them in her task force, and I personally, along with other of my colleagues, received a letter from her refusing. Instead, she chose only LGBT professionals who were already committed to the conclusions based on political or philosophical grounds. Many take their biased report and further distort it. The American Psychological Association's task force, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and licensing boards agree. Change-allowing therapy today uses non-aversive methods. Testimonies of aversive methods have been documented to be fraudulent and reported to the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. The APA task force found no valid causal evidence of harm and did not declare change-allowing therapy unethical. I and my colleagues who do change-allowing therapy are members of the American Psychological Association. We have never been thrown out of our association they have not considered the therapy and not declared it unethical. Actually, the APA task force said it had no scientific evidence that gay affirmative therapy is safe or effective. And recent reviews say LGBT affirmative therapy still has many limitations. Yet, the task force gave affirmative therapy a pass and recommended it. The British Psychological Society said there is limited empirical support for affirmative practice. The APA task force said its conclusion was tentative, based on anecdotal, not scientific evidence. Research reported benefits of change-allowing therapy that the task force knew but failed to report even as anecdotal evidence includes decreased depression, frequency and intensity of homosexual thoughts, increased self-acceptance, self-understanding and self-esteem, personal power, emotional stability, spirituality, satisfying relationships, relationships with church, God, and family, trust of the opposite sex, and interest in heterosexual dating. To scientifically prove that sexual orientation change efforts, sometimes has been referred to SOCI, is generally harmful, one would have to prove that all of the following are true. They would have to prove the number of clients who report harm from SOCI exceeds those who report benefits. Negative mental and physical health indicators among those who have undergone SOCI exceed those among persons who have undergone alternative gay affirmative therapy, had no therapy at all, had therapy or counseling for other conditions. There simply is no scientific evidence to prove each of these points. 600 studies over 125 years, including studies published in peer-reviewed journals of the American Psychological Association by APA members, have found when the therapy is done right, it is effective. APA presidents have provided successful change therapy and opposed bans. Here is a link to a research review from 2000 to the present. Here's a review through 2009. It covers 5 meta-research reviews. APA presidents have conducted sexual change-allowing therapy. Here are links for that. Under a therapy ban, clients get coerced, unethical therapy, or no therapy. People who want change-allowing therapy can instead have exactly what they do not want: gay affirmative or so-called neutral therapy that does not lift a finger to offer trauma treatments that are open to change. It is unethical for a therapist to engage in or coerce these therapies a client does not want. No research supports doing so. Therapists will refuse to do it. The Royal College of Psychiatrists says the college believes strongly in evidence-based treatment. Does the college have evidence that gay affirmative therapy or so-called neutral treatment to people who do not want it is safe or effective? No, it does not. The Royal College of Psychiatrists says the college holds the view that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people have exactly similar rights and responsibilities as all citizens. This includes right to protection from therapies that are potentially damaging. Coercing therapy a client does not want, or leaving a client with no therapy, is potentially damaging. It boxes them into hopelessness and potential suicidality. Therapy bans in the U.S. have left many with no therapy. Since 14 of the 50 United States censored change-allowing therapy for minors, most states rejected these bans. Many LGB minors who want change get no professional mental health services in these states. Many therapists are afraid because of the law and legal advice to see them. In the UK, this fate may happen to adults also. Some people with same-sex sexual or gender incongruence are childhood victims of abuse or are suicidal. Cutting off access to professional services is unjust, cruel, and dangerous. Therapy bans are unjust and unconstitutional in the U.S. because One cannot censor speech just because it is uttered by a professional, and banning one kind of therapy and not the other kind is unequal application of the law. Banning it leads to a two-tiered mental health system. Those who want affirmative therapy can get it, and their therapist can get paid. Those who want professional change-allowing therapy can't get it. But if they are permitted to see an unlicensed person or someone who's not getting paid, they do not get to see a professional therapist, someone who is trained in evidence-based trauma treatments, and the provider may have to work for free. This is unjust. A therapy ban is an attempt to coerce appliance with a view of sexual orientation and gender identity by censoring speech because of a belief that doing so is necessary to support all LGBT people. But Dr. Caitlin Ryan, who researches LGBT youth and works with the National Center for Lesbian Rights in the United States, says evangelical families can positively influence health, and a theological shift is not necessary. Viewpoint discrimination using law to push a viewpoint is unconstitutional in U.S. law. You may not like someone's view, and a view that leads to true happiness for others may not work for you or your family member. But should they have their freedoms and livelihoods, potentially their property and children, taken away from them? The United Kingdom should acknowledge divergent paths and celebrate freedom. Testimonies of people who made real change and found true joy through professional therapy or faith-based services can be found at oncegay.com and voicesofchange.net. Thank you.
Many people believe that sexual orientation is a fixed and unchangeable category of existence, and for them, any professional or pastoral initiative to support people leaving homosexual behaviors and feelings is both dangerous and harmful. Yet, ask them for the evidence of peer-reviewed research and scholarship that shows categorically that on average such interventions are harmful, and your request will be met with silence, because it simply doesn't exist. The attempt to close down professional therapeutic and counseling work, which takes seriously the goals of autonomous individuals seeking to get out of homosexual practices, means that once a person identifies as gay, there is no way of leaving either the identity or the lifestyle. This means that now gay is mandatory, and once a person decides to go in that direction, they must stay gay, in spite of the fact that science shows that sexuality is fluid and changeable. The interview that follows has an important bearing on this subject.
There are so many men from, in my case, about 10 to 29, some older, but this age group, I have noticed, are coming to me much more fast now and are very confused in gender and sexuality issues, and they're hurting. They're often men of faith who this involves faith matters, and they're confused, sad, angry, feel stuck in terms of their gender identity and sexuality. And to be able to help them actually have deep healing experiences that get down to the root causes of homosexual issues that results in a spontaneous lessening or dissipation of homosexual feelings and the rise of the authentic, secure, self-esteemed self is a pure joy for me.
If you'd like to hear the full interview, go to voicesofthesilence.tv. Subscribe at no cost to access all the interviews of those who are coming out of homosexual practices and those who support them. And don't forget to buy our DVD, Voices of the Silence, Part 1. Thank you so much for that work, Laura. I'm sorry to say that David Pickup is not able to be with us because of a passport issue, But I suspect he's listening to us today, and I want to still introduce him, so to speak, and then we have the opportunity to listen to a pre-recorded interview that we did recently. David Pickup, who can't be here, is a licensed marriage and family therapist working out of 2 clinics, one in California and one in Texas. He's a reintegrative therapist and a doctoral candidate in psychology at California Southern University. He's a member of the American Psychological Association and the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. He serves also as a board member of the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity. He co-leads the National Task Force for Therapy Equality. He's a national campaigner in the USA and most recently appeared with Dr. James Dobson on Family Talk, a conservative Christian radio show. So let's welcome David, even though he's in New York at this moment.
David, can you introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
My name is David Pickup. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I have 2 practices, private practices, one, my main one in Dallas, Texas, and my secondary in the Los Angeles, California area.
What motivates you to work therapeutically in this area?
There are so many men from, in my case, about 10 to 29, some older, but this age group, I have noticed are coming to me much more fast now and are very confused in gender and sexuality issues, and they're hurting. They're often men of faith who this involves faith matters, and they're confused, sad, angry, feel stuck in terms of their gender identity and sexuality. And to be able to help them actually have deep healing experiences that get down to the root causes of homosexual issues that results in a spontaneous lessening or dissipation of homosexual feelings and the rise of the authentic, secure, self-esteemed self is a pure joy for me. So that's why I do this, because of such a great problem that is so, after a period of time, beautifully worked out.
So what is it that flips? What is it that comes together or aligns to bring about this dramatic change by the sound of it?
Even though there's a lot of emotional manifestations and several underpinnings of emotional wounds, what you're asking about is a moment of change, which is a great question, because a lot of people think that, well, change is just nowhere near possible in any way. But in my office, I see firsthand men, let's say their homosexual feelings are based on a severe case of gender identity inferiority, and they project that need outward and are only seeing the beauty and wholeness of maleness in another man's body that becomes eroticized. When that shame-based statement about them that at first says they're worthless as men, they're stuck and they will always be stuck, they're worthless, those messages, when those messages are relieved, the moment of grief and anger that's authentic, that they've never faced before, that's underneath those homosexual feelings, when that's wiped out of the way over a period of time, there are actually moments in my office where that change automatically happens, because we're dealing and feeling with what's really going on underneath the homosexual attractions. And so when they come up out of that grief process, the moment of change happens, because when they return to who or what they've been erotically attracted to before, they look at and they have a cathartic experience of some level, of some type. And they say things like, "Oh, wow, David, I just had one last week, said to me, this whole," I'm paraphrasing, "but this whole manhood thing, this feels a lot better than sex with men." those are unsolicited responses. So those are moments of actual emotional change, not just behavioral change. And let's face it, sexual pleasure is a pretty heavy-duty kind of pleasure. And I know two things when these men spontaneously describe these cathartic moments of change. First of all, for them, it isn't inborn, these issues, and it's changeable.
Is that about the therapeutic process, or is it about the relationship with the therapist? What is it that is triggering this catharsis?
It's about both the relationship with the therapist and the therapy itself. In terms of clinical speak, the therapy, in the kind of therapy I do, which is authentic reparative therapy, large R, reparative therapy through psychodynamic processes gets down to where these wounds actually originated that are being repressed in the body and mind and emotions, and releases that because of the nature of the psychodynamic processes. But this probably won't happen very easily or at all if it first and foremost is not based on a very compassionate, trusted relationship in which the trust and the transference between a client and therapist, this kind of thing won't happen if that is not really set up in the beginning for a wonderful relationship. So they're both necessary.
Is it always trauma?
In my experience, I've never seen a client who has not had some level of some type of trauma, including the kind of trauma that's very hard to pin down sometimes, which is neglect type of trauma. In America, neglect is definitely considered professionally as a definite form of trauma. It may come in the form in some cases where, let's say a boy is just, and I know of at least one case where a boy was simply never touched at all favorably by any of his male role models. That's neglect, and it can develop a voracious appetite for physical affection that is possible, at least, to get sexualized later on in puberty. So that in itself is trauma. It sometimes feels a little deceptive or hard to pin down, and it makes people wonder, well, where's the trauma? But every time, the body never lies. And when we do these emotional processes, I don't force people to feel anything. This stuff automatically comes up, which is either neglect or overt trauma of some type, whether it's beating or shaming incidences or actual sexual abuse, for instance.
As I listen to you, one would not think that anybody could have any objections to what you're doing. And yet this is controversial. Why is that the case?
It's controversial, in my opinion, because the theory of this therapy questions the validity of the foundation of gay ideology, which is, to be succinct, I was born naturally this way. Reparative therapy is for those people who know that, at least for them, these homosexual feelings were not caused by some genetic marker or there is no gay gene, for instance, but they are based on emotional wounds, gender shame, and unmet emotional needs, to be succinct. And so for me to suggest that, it contradicts the foundation stone of what gay ideology says, and so therefore is felt as threatening or perceived to be threatening to the very personhood of people who believe the opposite.
And would there be clients who come and begin working and who say that this is not for me and would go in another direction? What's your reaction to that?
Yes, and my reaction, both personally and professionally, even in terms of ethics, is to wish them well and to not coerce them. And to, an example of that would be, I have gay clients. Some people are shocked about that. I don't put them down. I don't say, hey, you should change. If they ask me about what I do, or I should say, everybody knows what I do, but I think it's a testament to the trust between therapist and client when I say that even though some of these gay guys know what I do, they're not interested in changing, and yet our trusting relationship is trusting enough, and that I help them in so many other areas, and we have good relationships. So if someone comes to me, especially if it's a minor child, I don't. I handle it by actually, in some cases, just recently, I've refused to treat someone or bring about these concepts or processes if they have no interest in changing at all or even believing in what I believe. I in effect, I may not affirm what their beliefs are at all, but I certainly leave room for them to believe what they feel fulfills them.
So it's not always faith-based, the work that you do?
It's not always faith-based, but it's almost always faith-based. But even in faith-based clients, if someone wants to come and I can either, if they're a minor and I feel they're being coerced, refuse to do that. But even if they're an adult and I'm sensing that they really don't want to do this work, I'll be, in a supportive way, I believe, challenging them to ethically get across the fact that nothing's going to work. Whatever therapy for any issue is never going to work if someone's not truly motivated. So I always keep an ear out to try to assess for motivation.
I've heard you refer to your work as authentic reparative therapy. Does that mean that there are other types of reparative therapy that don't work or are inauthentic? How does what you do fit into mainstream psychotherapy?
What I do fits into mainstream psychotherapy in some basic ways. Even though the processes are used for goals that many members of our profession would not want to do, the fact is that I do, in fact, psychodynamic and some cognitive behavioral therapy which resolves these issues of sexuality and gender issues. These processes are based on time-honored, approved, well thought of, well-respected psychodynamic or cognitive behavioral techniques that are shown to be effective for a lot of the population for the last almost 100 years. So the other kind of therapies that don't pay attention to the shame as expertly, I might say, may not be as effective because they're not really dealing deeply or resolutely enough with the wounds I've mentioned earlier. Or then there's the other kinds of what people call counseling or therapy that may actually not be done by licensed, trained individuals. And we have to be really careful about that because if someone, and it's an ethical principle here in America, if someone is not trained well in what they say they're doing, that's unethical in this country. So it's an important issue. I'm glad you raised that.
Your own journey, David, can you say something about the pathway you've taken as a man growing and maturing?
Yes, my story is pretty long actually, so I'll make a long story relatively short. I was one of those 5-year-old boys who was sexually abused by a pedophile many years ago. It wasn't violent, but it was still abuse, I assure you. And so that, plus not getting a lot of male affirmation or male affection and approval, those things, that combined together to result in homosexual feelings when I reached puberty. Somewhat later in the teenage years. And so I was also, if I may say, the poster child for repression. And so being kind of a faith-based, definitely a faith-based boy and young man, I, out of a sense of shame, repressed all of that stuff. And it didn't go anywhere, it just came up later. And so, long story short, I had some experiences in which I knew sexually they didn't fit my faith nor who I believed I was, which was born heterosexual. And so then I finally found an authentic reparative therapist years later as an adult and spent many years going through those very same deep emotional processes I've just described earlier. And it really worked for me. Plus my own work in my own courage to seek out healthy male relationships that really touched me and filled some of those needs and really did a lot of healing in my personal life, not just the therapeutic office, which is the goal, in my opinion, of all therapy. and it resulted in the rise of my authentic self and my feelings, not just in my head knowledge, but my feelings of secure male gender, and my feelings began to lessen and dissipate and change. My feelings for women automatically began to develop, and I'm one of those. Not that other levels of change are not very important and very worthy, but I'm one of those cases where these feelings, because I did the emotional work, I hung in there and I did it. I just don't have homosexual feelings anymore. I can't even remember the last time I was actually aroused by some guy or some picture or whatever. If I feel them maybe beginning, I guess, to come up a little bit, I've done so much work, I know myself so well, that it's the wounds that come up first. For instance, I can remember being shamed as a little boy and feeling maybe separate or isolated or different in a shame-based way than other guys. And when I remember the emotional work I did and get back into, and I'm talking about a period of time that's now microseconds, by the way, because I've done so much work in the past. When my body remembers automatically that resolution and feel this authentic thing coming up in me, if any feeling was going to come up, it just doesn't. It just doesn't, because I'm, as a result of all the work I've done.
In your goal to be helpful to other people and to get a good understanding across to people who don't understand, have you ever felt silenced?
I've felt silenced before therapy or after? As a clinician or as a person?
Either and both.
Okay.
Primarily, probably as a therapist, as somebody working in this domain.
As a clinician, I've absolutely felt silenced and have pushed back in ethical and very, what I might say, bold ways. I'm now a national lobbyist in America that seeks to educate legislators in as many states as possible, which we and my team have been doing this for the past 3 years, because there's all kinds of dangerous government laws that all say the same thing, that this kind of therapy should be outlawed, lose our licenses for, or maybe even be prosecuted for conducting this kind of therapy. And my voice it's been attempted to, in some cases through laws, actually accomplished, such as in California, where they have a law that is now actually a therapy ban for children. So yes, my voice has been silenced, and yet I'm doing something about it. I've chosen to do that, and like I said, I'm a national lobbyist to prevent or take down these laws that are really harming a lot of children who need and want these therapies.
So what's your understanding of why this is happening, this silencing and this close down?
The shutting down of ideas is an old trick. Sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's unconscious. In my experience, the vociferousness of the gay activism in this country is so treacherous that they're actually trying to shut down ideas. Well, that's not even an American concept. In America, we're free to express free speech, ideas. So I'm all for a gay person having the right to express themselves. But when it comes down to giving me rights to express myself, therapeutic or personally, on these issues, they will actually attempt through laws or through demeaning language in public, online, or what have you. They'll seek to shut actually our voices down, my voice down. So that's happening in California, where I'm licensed, and that's happening in other states where I'm not licensed. So far in Texas, we still retain those great freedoms to have a voice.
Tell me about the Human Rights Committee that I know you've been involved in at the UN.
The human rights, I believe there's several committees, but if we're going to talk about them en masse for a minute, because they're trying to do the same basic thing. The human rights committees in the UN, some of them, are trying to, same thing in the United States, demean, provoke, tear down people who do authentic change therapies. They do this not by appealing to science, even though in the verbiage they'll appeal to science, but when you look at the science is not real, valid research, or they are cherry-picking things out of the research that they want to hear. And so these committees are trying to cut our rights worldwide, make recommendations that all these therapies should be banned and found to be illegal, and people eventually, in my opinion, to be prosecuted for such. And then just yesterday, another committee from the UN, who's had input by a lot of American gay organizations, gay activist organizations, has brought about a new statement saying that men who have sex with men have essential rights, which includes 10-year-old boys to have sex with men. So the world, through the UN, is beginning its slow march towards pedophilia. And my question is to America and the world, are we going to let this same thing throughout history occur in the modern age? Rome, ancient Rome, comes to mind. Are we really going to let pederasty, or some form of that, exist in the world today? Because that's where some of our professional committees and organizations are trying to make us move towards.
Would you define change? What do you mean by change?
Change can mean several different things, and I think we all should be proud of that. A lot of people think, in error, that we're talking about somebody flips a light switch and you go from completely and always gay to completely and always heterosexual in terms of just feeling.
But a moment ago you spoke about cathartic moments that take place in your office. So put that into context about what you're saying now about change.
So the cathartic moments of change happen in the office, and more, both in amount and in deepness of fulfilling traits in a man, we'll say, because we're dealing and feeling with the actual wounds that are causing the homosexual feelings. And so over a period of time, sexuality that most clinicians, except on some level nowadays, is actually on a continuum. That's the point. So nobody who's a good therapist is going to say, oh, it's like a light switch and a miracle, a magic pill. It's not what we're talking about when we're talking about change. We're talking about a process of events that happens, I'm being generic, but mainly over a year or two, and in some cases, like my case, many years. It takes people that long sometimes to really affect change because their wounds have been so deep. But this is the same kind of thing that you would say, let's say we were dealing, even though homosexuality I don't believe is a mental illness, let's say you were dealing actually with a depressed client. Would you say change hasn't been possible or real or of value if if it took him a year to just have a 50% reduction in depressive qualities? No, you wouldn't say that. You would congratulate him. You would further that change. You would run alongside him to embolden him to continue on that if he's motivated to do so. It's the same thing in terms of change with reparative therapy.
Christianity changed Europe completely. I mean, what we see now is the result of the Christian faith. Even Roman law, which became important later on in the history of Europe, was actually Christianized Roman law.
We're at a stage at the moment in our history in Western civilization when some voices are being silenced.
I use the term sexual politics to describe the rise of feminist politics and more recently homosexualist politics. It's very striking that in the last 40 years or so, the elephant in the room in the Western world has been this rise of sexual politics.
Where are we going to start if we don't have any moral or spiritual tradition that is acknowledged.
Had certain compulsive behaviours, patterns in my life, which had come to a head and had really started to interfere with my ability to function.
Ich bin vom Beruf Sozialarbeiter und mit dem Thema Homosexualität.
I began to feel very overly connected.
To become a pre-op transsexual woman. I was born a boy and I lived as a woman for a number of years.
So when I was around the age of 19, 20, I just finally opened up to a very good friend of mine. And we became very close very soon in our friendships and we really opened up to one another.
Eigentlich erleben, dass ich nicht dazugehöre, dass ich nicht angenommen bin bei denen.
And at some point, like, we started to become very dependent on one another emotionally.
Desires to be close to men, but he's afraid to be close to men. And that tension is resolved in fantasy through sex.
So this was a whole new world. And I was very...
Facing Europe today is what he calls
ganz große Schwierigkeit.
Ich heiße David und ich bin 44 Jahre.
I wish that I had been able to access much earlier.
We started to become very dependent on one another emotionally.
And I have a deep heart for people now who are in my situation, who need help.
It's a great honor for me today to invite my colleague and really co-chairman of the IFTCC, Dr. Christel van Holt, who has worked as a pediatrician in Germany, briefly in India and in South Africa. Her special interest is child development and attachment theory. She's a former director of the German Institute for Youth and Society, and in 2004 she spoke before the Judiciary Committee of the German Bundestag, advocating for the rights of children to have both a mother and a father. She's a member of the Pediatric Psychosocial Development Committee, an external subcommittee of the American College of Pediatricians. Welcome to you, Christel, but before you come, there's a clip that I think we might enjoy. No? No, it is. Without further ado, Christel, could you come?
Thank you very much. I'm going to present the history of a woman who suffered from gender dysphoria in childhood and later from transsexualism. I have known her very well for many years up until now, and I want to thank her for allowing me to present main aspects of her life story here. I changed her name as well as some small biographical details. And I'd like to apologize for any shortcomings in my English. Anna, not her real name, was born in Western Europe and when grown up, moved to Germany. She is now 48 years old. Anna is the eldest of 2 daughters. Her parents were married. Looking from the outside, it was a normal middle-class family. Anna's childhood was inconspicuous. However, she had always wanted to be a boy. When she was in kindergarten and about 3 to 4 years old, she already wanted to be a boy. Her female body developed normally during puberty. In hindsight, she says about her puberty, "During my years of adolescence, I frequently asked myself who or what I actually was. With regard to my gender identity, my being a woman, I did not have any guide except for my feelings. And my feelings told me I am a man. Actually, my body should be that of a man. That pressure inside of me, the desire to no longer be a woman, became increasingly unbearable. I often longed to die. After finishing school and a professional education, Anna worked as a musician in a band where she increasingly presented herself as a man. She took on a male first name, which was completely accepted by her friends. She had several sexual relationships with women, all of which ended in a very painful breakup. At the age of 25, Anna entered therapy with a female doctor who was a psychiatrist and psychotherapist. A few months later, Anna began with testosterone injections, testosterone, the male sex hormone. And soon after that, she presented herself to a leading expert in Western Europe on transgender issues. His diagnosis was, Anna is transsexual. 3 professionals, all of whom were psychiatrists and psychotherapists, confirmed in 6 expert assessments that Anna is transsexual. The psychological difficulties Anna had during her puberty, some of which she was able to tell her specialists about, for example, her constant wish to die, her suicidal thoughts, were attributed to the circumstance that Anna was suffering from gender dysphoria. She was suffering from her persistent feeling of living in the wrong body, and the treatment for this was a so-called sex change. In the specialist's reports, it says that they had found nothing out of the ordinary, neither in Anna's childhood nor in her overall mental condition. In one of the reports, it says that Anna, quote, gives a firm and convincing impression in her self-expression as a man. Soon a male first name was entered into Anna's passport, and shortly after that, Anna had her so-called sex reassignment surgeries, that is the removal of her breasts, her uterus, and her ovaries. About her therapy before she went on to the surgeries, Anna says in hindsight, the therapist didn't get a single word out of me. I was silent. I did not know what to say. I was suffering quietly within myself. I had no words for my suffering, no language. What did I want? I did not know. I was simply convinced that I was a man in the wrong body. The psychological conflicts were so deep within me, one does not want to address those inner conflicts because there is no one to offer an alternative perspective, such as maybe there is an option other than hormones and surgery. And what lies underneath the surface is so terrible that one doesn't want to look at it. 6 months after her surgeries, Anna became a Christian. She told me, one day during a quiet time of prayer, a thought came to me, and I asked myself how God created me, whether He made me man or woman. In that moment, I knew deep inside myself that I was a woman. But the thought was still too difficult for me. I needed another entire year before I could make the decision, yes, I want to live as a woman again. It was the most difficult decision in my life. The thought of facing my parents as a woman was almost unbearable. I felt so ashamed. In order to be able to go on her path of change, Anna moved to another geographical location where she had found desperately needed new resources. She found a new therapist, a man who worked with transactional analysis and did a lot of inner child work with her. She found a female pastoral advisor to whom she could gradually open up, and very important too, she found new Christian friends. Anna says in hindsight, when I told my therapist before the surgeries that everything was fine with me and my family, I was convinced of that. In reality, my inner wounds, my inner terror and pain were so huge that I had completely suppressed them. I had to suppress them in order to survive. The detransitioning process of Anna took about 6 years, and it was another 4 years before she could say that she really enjoys being a woman. Gradually, step by step, she could face her inner wounds. Some quotes from Anna. I had to learn that my wounds were a reality, that they were true. I had to feel the pain and deprivation, and I had to learn to cry. I had to mourn the things that never were. I had to learn to give room for my anger against so many unfair and painful things in my life. When I learned to express my buried anger, it became an important means of strength to escape from the prison that had always prevented me from showing myself, my real self, to the world. About her childhood, Anna says in hindsight, my childhood was filled with shame, fear, and insecurity. A typical situation I recall, my mother and I were in a department store. I must have been 7 or 8 years old. I was running around among the clothes racks until my mother called me, Anna. When I heard my name, I felt tremendous shame. Looking back at my childhood, I have a picture in my mind. I am lying on the diaper changing table, and my mother is looking at me with love. But in the next moment, all of a sudden, she looks at me in a powerful, aggressive manner, like a wolf, her hair standing on end. I am full of fear and terror. To me, my mother was like a monster, unpredictable and destructive. I always longed for her, but it was dangerous to approach her. The atmosphere around her was characterized by aggressiveness. She would slap me in the face without any reason at all. At some point, I started to duck when she would just as much as raise an arm. The atmosphere at home was always tense. It is true, I never wanted to be a girl, I always wanted to be a boy. But in reality, I never wanted to be at all. My main conflicts were, I am not right. I must not show myself. I am drowning in shame. Regrettably, Anna's father was no support for Anna's development either. Anna describes him as a sexually addicted man. Anna says today, my father was surrounded by a sexualized atmosphere. I've often asked myself if there was any sexual abuse at an early point in my life, but I have no evidence of that. The sexualized atmosphere Anna's father spread certainly contributed to the shame Anna felt about herself. She never felt at ease in his arms. When Anna was 12 years old, there was a sexual assault on her by her father, a clearly inappropriate touching, but it was a single event. Anna says, neither my father nor my mother were able to do anything to affirm me as a person. From my father, I got the message that women are worthless. For more than 15 years during my childhood, I suffered from the same horrible nightmares. As a child and an adolescent, I would often sit in my room and cry. I did not know why. Can we have the picture? For many years, Anna was haunted by the thoughts of suicide. She had a strong compulsion towards self-destruction, as we can see in the picture here, which she painted during her journey of detransitioning. Anna, the real Anna, is drowned. And the words underneath say, it's in German, not being, hatred, no love, death, not being wanted, shame, despised, filth, swamp. It's a picture of a deeply traumatized woman. I will come back later to that. What helped Anna on her journey? A few glimpses. Again, quotes from her. It took me a long time to build trust, to not always have to be nice, but to be authentic, to have the courage for a dispute and an open conflict, to catch up in the development of my emotional intelligence, to accept help, to become more and more honest, to be able one day to tell someone about my deepest feelings, and to have the experience that when I say something, no matter what, I'm taken seriously and I'm not judged or condemned. Again, some quotes from her. One day again, I felt tremendous pain welling up inside me about my mother. It was so painful that I just screamed, and that happened several times. I was with a friend. She was very motherly. She had to close the window so that no one would hear me screaming. While I was experiencing this incredible pain, she took me in her arms and I felt I am not alone. Somebody understands me. Somebody holds me. I can now allow myself to feel the pain and accept it. There was comfort and healing in that. What Anna experienced was, I am being held. I am allowed to be. Especially through therapy, Anna learned to feel feelings like shame, anger, pain, sadness, fear, helplessness, self-hatred, abandonment, and deep loneliness. However, those feelings then welled up in her so massively that she became depressed and more than once did not want to go on living. She therefore decided to spend 6 weeks in a psychiatric hospital which offered body-oriented therapies. There she lost her fear of her emotions. Today she says, I can cope with what I feel inside of me. One experience from her hospital time, and again a quote from her. During one of my therapeutic exercises, I saw a picture in my mind. There was a trash can, and I had been thrown into it. In the therapeutic session, I literally climbed out of that trash can and made a renewed decision to live my life. I said aloud, I am Anna, and this time I am going to stay here. This ability to let myself be seen was a prerequisite for my ability to receive more love from other people and from God. About 6 years into her journey, Anna applied for the official restitution of her female first name so that her girl's name would be back in her passport. The same transgender specialist whose assessment had led her the way to sex reassignment surgery now issued a report for her so that Anna could have her girl's name, which reflected her true self, back in the official papers. In the conversation with Anna, he admitted, I have never met anyone who was really happy after the surgeries. And Anna adds, it's a deceptive package because my problems had not been solved. Today, about 10 years later, Anna says, I don't suffer anymore. I like to be a woman. I don't have to wait anymore for anyone to give me permission to be. I am who I am. Some general considerations at the end. There's no evidence that transsexual feelings are inborn or genetically determined, and there are also no brain studies that would support this idea. Anna was a deeply traumatized woman. Besides her difficult and probably traumatic relationship with her father, she suffered from an attachment trauma, an early relational trauma in the relationship with her mother in the first 2 years of her life. We know from infant research that the mother's face is the most potent visual stimulus in the child's world, especially during infancy. And remember her picture of lying on the diaper changing table and this unpredictable, aggressive face of the mother. It is well known that direct gaze can mediate not only loving but powerful aggressive messages. This is extremely traumatizing for a small child. The image of the aggressive face as well as the infant's bodily reaction to it are stored in the autobiographical memory. Anna once said, "I see a picture in my mind. It's a house which is burning on the inside. It's not burning on the outside, only on the inside. I step into this house and I'm standing in the midst of the harsh flames. Actually, one would normally think I would have to scream like hell, but I don't feel anything at all. I'm very sad that I do not feel anything and that I'm not able to get out of myself." This is an inner picture of overwhelming stress. When an infant experiences overwhelming stress, it experiences frantic distress and reacts with panic, fear, terror, fear of death, and then dissociation, which is no feelings anymore. And I experienced that unpredictably again and again. So her traumatic experiences were chronic and cumulative, not a one-time event. Under overwhelming stress and the chaotic bodily reactions to it, an infant cannot develop a secure sense of self, maybe no sense of self at all. The leading American brain researcher and expert in attachment theory, Alan Shore, writes, "Traumatic attachment experiences in the first 2 years of life negatively impact brain development," and that's about the right brain, the feeling brain, "and negatively impact the child's sense of self. It may even produce deficits in identifying a corporeal image of self." Anna's name, and we see this in the picture here, was synonymous for her with annihilation, with destruction of the person she was. And the wish to be a boy may have very well been a defense mechanism against this feeling of fear, terror, of fear of death, of not being allowed to be, of not being allowed to develop her real self. Anna once said, I am free floating in space, with no foothold, no ground beneath my feet, no security." Fortunately, that all changed. Today, Anna says, maybe some people think the diagnosis transsexuality was wrong. However, it was not wrong. I was transsexual. It was just that there was something else lying deep beneath this surface. Anna is not the only woman with a transgender problem whom I have known. They all taught me we need more psychotherapy for transgender issues, not less. Thank you.
Despite scientific findings which emphasize fluidity in sexuality, sexual orientation is still being presented to the contrary as fixed and unalterable. The American Psychological Association, for example, has long documented that many people report having undergone notable shifts in their patterns of sexual attraction, behaviors, or orientation identities over time. And in 2014, the Royal College of Psychiatrists changed its position statement, which up to then had claimed that sexual orientation was genetic and thus fixed, to recognize that sexual orientation does in fact change and is responsive to postnatal influences. Yet activists in the USA and Europe, even including the mental health institutions themselves, continue to demand that professional and pastoral support helping people to leave unwanted homosexual feelings should be criminalized. Thus, the Must Stay Gay or mandatory gay legislation proposals in several jurisdictions remove the chance of people getting help to live in ways that they choose. Each person in this series of interviews recognizes that they are not victims of their sexual feelings. They choose to leave homosexual behaviors, and as they do, many find that their feelings and patternings change. Listen to this.
When I was young, I coveted the female body. I wanted to be female. I wanted to look like a woman. I wanted to feel like a woman. And that was expressed a few times in my childhood. As I got older and I reached my teenage years, I experienced a lot of expressions of men looking at me and telling me that I wasn't a man, that I wasn't masculine enough, that I didn't look like a man, that I didn't have the broad shoulders. This carried on into my adulthood, and the frustration of feeling not like a man really led me down a strange path. That path was, I realized that I was miserable as a man, and if I lived as a woman, perhaps things would change. And so I decided to become a pre-op transsexual woman. I was born a boy, and I lived as a woman for a number of years.
If you'd like to hear the full interview, go to voicesofthesilenced.tv. Subscribe at no cost to access all the interviews of those who are coming out of homosexual practices and those who support them. And don't forget to buy our DVD, Voices of the Silenced, Part 1.
I have the honor and pleasure to introduce to you now Dr. Quentin van Meter. He has come specifically for this event from Atlanta, United States, to London. Dr. van Meter is a professor of pediatrics and an endocrinologist. His training in transgender medicine began in his fellowship years under Professor John Money at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. Dr. van Meter has a private practice, and he is president of the American College of Pediatricians, and one of their mottos is putting always the child's needs first.
First, I would like to thank the organizers of this meeting for inviting me. The CVs of the folks that have spoken before me are rather impressive. I'm just a regular old pediatric endocrinologist in private practice in Atlanta, Georgia. I have a long career, 44 years of practicing pediatrics and also pediatric endocrinology. And from that experience, I gleaned my worldview of patients and their problems. When the whole transgender issue began to surface in the past decade or so, I focused back on my memories of what I learned from my fellowship years. First of all, I would like to make a disclaimer on the part of the fact that I am a speaker for a pharmaceutical company, AbbVie Pharmaceuticals, who produces a gonadotropin-releasing hormone agonist. That is a blocker for puberty. I use this medication in my practice for the FDA-approved guidelines of suppressing precocious or early puberty in children. This medication becomes a very strong part of the transgender treatment programs but in the United States it is not licensed for use, and my speaking on behalf of that product is not to sanction its use outside of the limits of the FDA-approved guidelines in the United States. I'm also involved in, aside from being a speaker, in clinical research studies with AbbVie. So the first thing I want to do is to look at the history of transgender medicine. There are what I refer to as the Three Musketeers. These are individuals who came on the scene in the United States in the late 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, and they were three of them. The first one I'll mention is Dr. Alfred Kinsey, who began the Kinsey Institute in 1947. He had clinical studies that he did along with publications in regard to sexuality, human sexuality. There is a museum at the Kinsey Institute which chronicles a lot of his work. He also, attached to that, has a museum of erotic art, which he collected. It's on display. His studies, most notably, included how children can be aroused sexually, and he did masturbation of males and females as infants, toddlers, and young children to see what results could come about. Next in line is Dr. Harry Benjamin. Now, understand Dr. Kinsey was not a physician. He was not a psychologist. He was an entomologist, someone who studies behavior and insect biology. Dr. Harry Benjamin was a family practice doctor who practiced primarily in New York City and who spent his summers in San Francisco with his family practice. He had a strong interest in allying with both Money and Kinsey to bring about new concepts of human sexuality. He was instrumental in providing medical therapy to Christine Jorgensen, who was one of the most notorious transsexual patients of the 1950s. Thirdly, John Money, who I knew personally and who I trained with in Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, was a graduate of Harvard, and he trained in psychology there. He was a clinical psychologist by licensure. He joined the Johns Hopkins faculty for a number of reasons, but most of them had to do with the fact that Johns Hopkins was the epicenter in the United States for clinical research and understanding of the biochemistry of hormone action in the developing fetus, which bring about either the male phenotype or the female phenotype. So he, at Johns Hopkins, had a population of patients that many other people did not have. Those children with what we refer to as ambiguous genitalia, and children who had precocious puberty, or some sort of hormone imbalance which mocked puberty but was not puberty, either coming from a hormone-producing tumor or some degree of hormonal dysfunction within the adrenal glands. Interestingly, in a biographic statement, he described himself as a pediatric endocrinologist, and he said he became one by traveling alongside of Dr. Lawson Wilkins, who was the preeminent and first pediatric endocrinologist in the United States back in the 1950s. Dr. Wilkins had a clinic with all of the patients that suffered from these various hormonal issues, and Dr. Money followed behind him, watching and observing, and by doing so claimed that he was, in truth, a pediatric endocrinologist. So we come to the term gender. It's a linguistic term, originally, categorizing nouns as either masculine or feminine. In French, le chat or la chaise. So it was not applied to human biology, and if you look in the medical literature prior to that time, only the term sex was used. John Money took the word to apply to what he called the inner sexed self. So we moved from there, and where we had basic human biology, that is to say, you were either male, XY chromosome, or female, XX chromosomes. The sex is binary. It is either male or it is female. There is a little tiny line between the blue rectangle and the pink rectangle, and that little tiny line represents disorders of sexual differentiation, a tiny, tiny fraction of the human population. Back in the day, they called these terms hermaphrodites or pseudohermaphrodites. Today they're referred to as disorders of sexual differentiation, under-virilized male or over-virilized female. It is an interesting concept that the trans activists blame the physician in the nursery or the Dell room for assigning the sex to the patient, as if that physician made a decision that was arbitrary and based on something that had nothing to do with biology. That sex was not assigned in the Dell room, it was recognized in the Dell room. Where it was assigned was at the moment of conception, either XX or XY. Now, we bring up the intersex problems or disorders of sexual differentiation. There is a concept of what's called a true hermaphrodite, that is an individual who contains gonadal tissue, both of the ovary and the testicle, because of a mishap in terms of division of cells. Both gonadal tissues are present in the same individual, and they vie for what kind of physical effects they have in utero. Contrasting that is the pseudohermaphrodite, so-called in the old terminology, who has the one gonad, and it's the gonadal tissue that belongs to their biologic sex. That is to say, a female whose genitalia are changed because of overproduction or overresponse to what we call androgens, which are the hormones classified as male hormones. Androgens actually exist in males and females, but they are balanced such that one takes over and is predominant in the life of that child. The other option is a undervirilized male, that is to say a male whose genitalia and physical structures did not respond to the hormonal therapy. So in those cases in the newborn nursery where a baby is born and the genital structures are confusing in their appearance, and that cannot be classified and assigned by the physician at birth, those kids are kept in the hospital until the chromosomal sex is determined. Now, in the past, in my early days of fellowship, that took several weeks because of technology. It can be determined essentially in a day's time by specialized technology and looking for the presence of the Y chromosome or its absence. So those babies then are sent home as indeterminate necessarily, and the Committee on Disorders of Sexual Differentiation, national organization, indicates that the child's sex should be considered and assigned based on a combined team of physicians, surgeons, and the parents to determine what they believe is medically the best for the child. There is a very super rare subset of this disorder called androgen insensitivity disorder. It used to be called testicular feminization. This is a patient whose gonads are testicles, whose chromosomes are XY, but the patient has absolutely no receptors anywhere in their body, not in any tissue system, any organ system, that can recognize testosterone. And so in utero, the baby's physical appearance essentially shows no signs of virilization at all. Now, the baby has testicles, which remain in the abdomen. The baby has a blind vaginal pouch, does not have a full vagina. The baby has no uterus, fallopian tubes. And that patient grows up appearing to be a totally normal female. The patient's brain has never experienced testosterone in the intrauterine environment to make any of its cells or the body's cell lines believe that the patient is actually a male. This baby is born and then discovered subsequently in young childhood if they herniate the gonadal tissue, or in adolescent years when they have no menstrual periods that develop, to find out that there are no ovaries present and that child, a young adult, is actually an XY female. And that child is labeled as such and grows up as a woman and has no gender dysphoria whatsoever. Those cases are extremely rare. A bit rarer than that even is partial androgen insensitivity, which is a genetic trait that occurs in certain populations in the world, most prominently in the Dominican Republic. And in those cases, the babies make testosterone, but they cannot convert it to the active metabolite, dihydrotestosterone. And they're missing an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase. Sounds kind of scientific and technical, but the bottom line is that when these children, who appear to be girls, and when they're born, get to puberty, the testosterone levels rise significantly and tissues begin to respond. And these children then turn physically from a female into a male at age 11 or so, when boys normally go into puberty. It's referred to as huevos once in the vernacular of the local population. in the Dominican culture, boys are worthwhile, girls are worthless. And so a family embraces the idea that their child would turn into a male and no longer have to be a female. And so it is culturally accepted. Again, a very rare circumstance. So we've got the male and female situation, and then we introduce, on top of that, the erotic sexual orientation scale that Dr. Kinsey developed. Now, this is a scale that you can see, if you look on the slide, on the left is blue, and on the right is pink. And that is a scale that evolves across, as was spoken of previously. There is not a fixed concept of one or the other necessarily, but there is a scale across which humans end up orienting themselves erotically to somewhere on that scale, and that scale is fluid and can change over time. Now, we add on top of that something in the middle, and that is gender. Gender is John Money's term, and John Money used that to describe the inner self. And if you can see, what we have here is a blend from one side of blue to pink, and most notably, in the middle is a gray zone or a white zone, which is neither male nor female, sort of a non-gender identity at all. So this is where we are using terminology today. What happens then is the concept of erotic sexual orientation is its own place, male and female is its own place, and what remains then strictly is simply gender. So gender then, as described by John Money, is a state of mind. Gender is not biology. So we want to talk a little bit further about John Money because having experience working with him, I have a fairly strong feeling about his concepts and ideologies. John Money used to say, I have an idea. Let's do this and see what happens. Now, this concept of intervention violates the Nuremberg rules that were established after the Nazi Holocaust in Germany, because there was a set of rules that were established that protected patients from being abused, and it laid out in the consequences of what happens if those things happen and the patient is abused. There was no informed consent in John Money's concepts. There was no ethics-based oversight. There were no control groups in what he felt. He felt, I want to do this to the child. I think this is going to happen. Let's do it, and we'll hope that what I think happens will happen. So some of his more famous interventions were medical castration of adults. Now, castration, removal of the testicles, was not considered an option, a legal option in the United States. But if you could give something to male sex offenders that cut off the stimulation from the pituitary gland to the testicles, that would drop the secretion of testosterone naturally, but it would leave the testicles intact. So it was a non-surgical option to give those male patients Depo-Provera. Depo-Provera is a very commonly used oral or injectable contraceptive in the United States and worldwide. In the males, this basically suppressed their production of testosterone. And as long as they were suppressed and their testosterone levels were low, their sexual behaviors became more diminished and their aggressiveness became more diminished. So this was done, again, without any thought other than it was used to suppress puberty and precocious puberty at that time because we did not have the more current therapies. And he used that essentially as a tool to medically castrate adults. One of his patients, when we were endocrine fellows, we often would get a call from Dr. Money's office, and we were pretty much always worried what was going to have to happen as a result of that call. Dr. Money asked for the fellow on call, which happened to be me that day, to go over to the penitentiary in Baltimore and examine a medically castrated adult who was taking Depo-Provera. The patient claimed that he was having breast tingling sensations, and Dr. Money wanted to know what that was all about. I got to the prison, got locked inside, went into the infirmary. I hope it's the last time I ever have to be locked into a prison. And I ended up examining the patient after I had a chance to get a history from him. And he described his life in prison as being very interesting because it flowed with the effect of the Depo-Provera shots. At the end of the month, he would feel his testosterone levels coming back up, and he said, my sex life in here is pretty good, as long as the Depo-Provera wears off. I didn't ask him what pretty good meant, I just left that one alone, and I did the physical exam and found absolutely nothing on his breast exam that would end up indicating there was a medical problem, and reported that back to Dr. Money. Subsequently, medical castration of sex offenders has been stopped as a practice. The other things that Dr. Money did were switching gender of children with ambiguous genitalia. And this, again, was one of his theories that he decided to try, and he had support of the surgical teams who would help after the patient was born to modify the appearance of the external genitalia. It was a combination of GYN surgeons and urologists who developed techniques to remove the enlarged clitoral structure and create what looked like a normal clitoris in a virilized female, to open the vaginal opening appropriately, to expose what was beneath and was anatomically normal, and to carry the patient on from there. He also ended up in a case of a child who had his penis accidentally burnt off by a botched circumcision. He decided that that baby needed to be reared as a female. That baby was reared as a female with Dr. Money's support from his staff, and we didn't have to do any hormonal manipulation, but the baby's testicles were removed as part of the surgical procedure, and a vagina was created as a blind pouch in the genital area. That patient had to undergo dilation of that vaginal structure through young childhood, not knowing necessarily why as a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old child. And the child began to have issues with severe depression and anxiety that mounted to the point where the therapist recommended to the parents that they tell the child that she was indeed born a male. And that patient immediately indicated, once he knew that he had felt something was wrong the entirety of his life, and that had essentially caused the anxiety and depression for him. He ended up having a little stub of genital tissue, of penile tissue, that could become erect so that he had some degree of sexual activity and satisfaction as an adult male and became married. And then he tragically took his life. So that patient became the cause célèbre in terms of undoing what John Money had been doing all along. My own personal experience with John Money was toward the end of my fellowship with a little patient that came from out of state, again to what we referred to as the medical mecca of disorders of hormones. This was a baby who had absolutely normal male structures, had a scrotum, had testicles, had a penis, but it was all very small in size. The chromosome of this baby was an XY, as expected. And this baby had what we now call hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism. That is to say, the brain was not signaling to the pituitary to change the genitalia from small to normal size at birth. Under the influence of the mother's placental hormones, this baby, who was a male, was able to virilize and produce all of what he needed from his own biologically active testicles to make his structures male. Being a male anatomically is a very active process in utero in the first 12 weeks of life. If there is no stimulation by testosterone, everything lays dormant and appears to be female at birth. So this baby was not ambiguous, this baby just was understimulated. And our theory was that we wanted to prove that that was the case. Now, we were kind of excited because Dr. Money happened to be out of the country, or so we thought, and we did not have to have this patient intervene or be interviewed by Dr. Money and his staff. So we developed a protocol which was based on sound science to stimulate this baby's testicles with hormones and to see whether or not, number one, the baby could produce testosterone, and number two, if the testosterone brought about physical enlargement of the penile structure to the point where it would be a normal newborn size. We developed the protocol. It was based, again, on clinical experience and our knowledge through literature. We sent the baby home on that protocol, which took 6 weeks and happened at home. And the baby came back. When the baby came back and it was scheduled in the clinic, I noticed that instead of his name being a male name, it was a female name. And that puzzled me a little bit. So I walked into the room, and here was the former little baby boy in a pink frock smock gown and a white eyelet bonnet. And the mother looked at me, and I said, "What happened? How did this happen?" And she said, "Well, Dr. Money met with me before I left. He evidently got back in town, and he was able to come talk to me, and he said, the medical therapies that these doctors are going to do for your child are barbaric and inappropriate and will not bring about any change at all. They do not know what they're talking about." So, Grandma was along with Mama, and I undiapered this little pink-frocked child and found an erect penis that was clearly a normal size and testicles that had developed to normal newborn size. And at that point in time, my attending physician had it out with Dr. Money, and Dr. Money was removed from access to our patients thereafter without specific permission of the chairman of the endocrine division. So that ended up being one of the things that brought Dr. Money's program to a close. Dr. Money, in adults, decided he was going to do a transsexual clinic. This is what it was not called transgender back then, it was called transsexual. And he recruited adults who thought they wanted to change their sex, and he would bring them in, evaluate them, and then he would basically make them cross-dress for a year and assume the role of the opposite sex. The vast majority of these were men who indicated they thought they were going to need to become women. They would cross-dress for a year, and then he would make sure they had a bank account, a savings account, that had money in it to be able to pay for some of this kind of therapy that was going to go on, primarily as an anchor point for them to be committed to stay with the therapy. So it had two purposes. The therapy was done essentially for free, but the money sort of made them convict themselves to sticking with the program. After that year, and the bank account being full, and they also had to have no record of being arrested for prostitution. Most of these males were on the streets dressed as women and were having sex with men as a lifestyle by choice. And so they had to have a clean record of no arrests. And then the surgeons took over and amputated the male genitalia, amputated the breasts in the women, who were few, and created these transsexual adults. So his experience there was that the patients, for a while, felt like they had made the right decision. But they lived their lives as caricatures of women, not as a standard adult female. They were very flamboyant, incredible amounts of makeup, again, looked like streetwalkers for the most part. So it was judged to be not a program that brought about reasonable outcomes. Now, John Money also had a lot of issues with perverse behavior. In the clinic, his psychohormonal clinic, the interviews with the patients were interesting. One particular case that I saw was a boy who had a testicular tumor that had caused a lot of testosterone production. And this little boy had an adult-sized penis at age 6. And we discovered it was fairly easy to figure this out. One testicle was extremely large, and the other testicle was not. And that large testicle, there was a definable tumor mass that you could feel. Dr. Money asked this boy on the initial evaluation, and all of these things were dictated and then transcribed into typed notes for us to stick in the endocrine record so we could read them and see them. He asked the boy how often the boy masturbated. He was a 6-year-old. And the boy indicated he didn't know what that was. So Dr. Money took a pencil and started stroking it, showing him this is what happens when you masturbate. And that child left. The next time he came to the clinic, he was interviewed by Money again, and this time the transcription said, asked how many times he masturbated. The boy was masturbating 6 to 8 times a day. So this was a situation where basically this boy was taught how to masturbate, which would not have happened outside of Dr. Money's influence. He also taunted female fellows. There were 2 in my group that trained around me who were fairly devoutly religious people and that was fairly well known about them. And Dr. Money did everything he could to offend them in every way with his lectures and how he treated them and how he affronted them with foul language and pornographic images in his teaching sessions. My favorite circumstance was a lecture that he gave. He had not created teaching slides yet, so he just had a notebook of crude pencil drawings. And he had theorized that amputees had the sense that their stump of the limb was actually a phallic structure that could be masturbated in fantasy. And he presented this to us as one of his new theories. I, being fairly brash and young at that point in time, raised my hand and I said, Dr. Money, I don't know what to say about this, but I trained in my pediatrics at the Naval Hospital in Oakland, California, which had the National Prosthetics Research Laboratory, which was essentially a place where Vietnam veterans who'd come back with damaged limbs were fitted with prosthetic limbs, hands, feet, whatever, and that they had a whole stable of these patients that were close by our pediatric ward that we got to meet these folks because they'd be in the elevator, in the hallway, in the wheelchair, and we chatted up with them. These folks that had amputations were evaluated completely from stem to stern about the psychological stress of adjusting to their limb amputations. And not once was there any theory of a sort of a dream of masturbating the stump. That was not essentially valid science from experience. So I mentioned that to him. He folded up his notebook and said, well, we're done today. And that theory disappeared. So that was kind of how he did things. He just sort of essentially had an idea, threw it out there. If somebody believed in it, he'd carry on with it. So I was able, at least temporarily, to stifle that theory in Dr. Money's teaching lectures. And lastly, when he wrote his books, and he was a prolific author, some of them were revered as sort of a Bible of human sexuality. He called up one day, again, he wanted to speak to the fellow on call. Again, lucky me, I answered the phone, and he said, Quentin, I am doing a new book. Tell me about gonadotropins. Now, it took me by surprise because I figured he'd been around endocrinology and he certainly should have known all about endocrine physiology by now. So I kind of gave him a quick synopsis, and he said, thanks very much. And then he used that in his book. Now, that is the depth of the research of the man, and that's why I think historically it's important to pay attention to where the idea of transgenderism came from and sort of handle it that way. So, Dr. Money's legacy. He failed to achieve good clinical outcomes. He had the patient who committed suicide. Dr. Paul McHugh arrived in 1980 or 82 and found the disarray in Dr. Money's psychohormonal group. And as chairman of the Department of Psychiatry, he closed the program down in utter shame and said, we will never do this again. Now, Dr. Money, one of his legacies that lived on past his experience of being on the Hopkins faculty, is that he began, or was instrumental in beginning, what was called the Harry Benjamin Society. Now, the Harry Benjamin Society was named after Dr. Benjamin, who I mentioned before, and it was essentially an interest group. It was something that came together with people who were interested in transsexualism or transgender medicine. And it was just an interest group. It was not a professional society at that time in terms of training or expertise. It was anybody that had a desire to express their opinions or in support of transgenderism or transsexualism could become a member. Now, the Harry Benjamin Society was viewed in the United States as kind of a super fringe, crazy bunch of folks. It had no basis in medical science. It was not accepted by mainstream organizations at the time. And so it was essentially thought of as someplace you wouldn't go if you were looking for valid medical treatment. The Harry Benjamin Society sort of disappeared, and in its place, it sort of was the basic organization from which the World Professional Association of Transgender Health arrived. Now, the WPATH is an organization, again, with essentially the same concept. If you are a friend of transgender, transsexual patients, this is where you want to come. Again, no degree requirements to be a member, no certification with medical training, and no degree of any kind. And if you look at the people who sign on behalf of the WPATH, it's everybody from physicians and mental health providers to just plain interested people. Membership requires that you be interested and that you pay your dues. So we see the decline of the effect of the Harry Benjamin Society, but in its place, a very more proactive kind of group. The bibliography that the WPATH puts together to claim its science, if you will, is actually a very substandard bibliography. It looks numerous. It's got about 150 items in the bibliography, but it is mostly anecdotal case reports or re-reporting the same information over and over again in different little journals around the world. And so if you look at some of the references that they choose, they're actually nothing to do with transgenderism at all, but many times to do with homosexuality. Now, transgenderism is its own unique diagnosis and clinical circumstance, but it is blended in by the LGBT activist community as if it's part of the brotherhood. The WPATH is, I call them on the warpath. They have essentially created their own science, if you will, and they have their own journal. It's the International Journal of Transsexual Health. And so that is a journal that publishes favorably articles about their agenda, political agenda. So let's look at the timeline about what's happened with transgenderism over time. Prior to the 1970s, essentially all the transgender medical care was done in Sweden and Denmark. That's where Christine Jorgensen went for the surgery changes. In 1950s, 60s, and 70s, under Johns Hopkins, the transgender clinic or transsexual clinic was sort of done through the mid-70s. And all along in the Scandinavian countries where this concept was accepted, there was a very strong social acceptance of transsexualism or transgenderism by the community, by the government, and by the healthcare services. In the 1980s, everything went underground. And in the United States, the major medical associations had nothing to do with transgender interventions other than recommending counseling. So in the US, you could not find anybody to go for transgender health unless you went to the Harry Benjamin Society website, which back then was not yet WPATH. And you would find a list of willing surgeons and willing physicians who would give hormones and who would do surgical treatments. This was all done under the radar, so people didn't know that that was going on necessarily, but the people who wished to be transitioned physically knew where to go, and they did go to those places. In the Canadian situation, Dr. Kenneth Zucker began his clinic under the Institute of Addiction and Mental Health. And he actually had experience taking these patients who were age 5 and on up through adolescence. And he delved deeply into the basement of cobwebs and all the psychological problems that Dr. Von Holt talked about with her patient, and found that if you went down into that deep and dark place and you shed light in there and you brought the patient through the transition of understanding their internal feelings that had been broiling and broiling around, that they would essentially return to their birth sex as an identity by the time that they were through therapy in the vast majority of patients. He had experience over those years with 560 patients. He's published his experience and the guidelines for treatment and evaluation in respectable medical journals. And he was essentially looked at as the guru of gender identity disorder all the way through the 80s, pretty much worldwide. So he provided care, much needed care, for the very small, relatively small number of patients that came from around the world and came to Toronto for his help. Meanwhile, back in Sweden, Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands, they were treating adults medically and surgically, and eventually began treating children medically and surgically as well. So in the early part of my practice, once I retired from the Navy in 1991 and came to Atlanta to practice medicine as a pediatrician and endocrinologist, in 1993, a patient came to my office. It was a family that moved from California. They were active duty military, and they moved very frequently. And this child came to me as a girl, And the parents confided in the exam room that indeed the child was a boy, but had believed that he was a girl, and he had consulted a psychiatrist in Los Angeles area who had indicated that the family should use the move to Atlanta as a means to change this child's identity sexually and raise that child as the girl that he wanted to be. So no one in my office other than my nurse knew that this patient was not a female. And I was asked to treat this patient because he was now 13 and he was developing well into mid-puberty with estrogen to stop his puberty. And I did not know what to do. So I called all the gray hairs that I knew, and I speak of gray hairs fondly, but the folks that I trained under and who were still around, and I said, what do I do? You know, I have not seen a single patient, transgender patient, since my fellowship days. I know of no one in the clinical world that I can go to except for you guys who've been around long enough. What do I do? None of them had any answers. There was no experience in the accepted medical community about what to do for this 13-year-old boy. So I was advised, well, if the psychiatrist is an expert, and that's what the psychiatrist says, let's go ahead and get him started on estrogen. So I developed a protocol with legal backing for informed consent with the parents and assent from the child to cover myself from future legal action against me, and began the child on estrogen. The family moved again very quickly, within 6 months, and they were gone. They moved to another city. I notified the folks in that geographic region that the family was moving there, and that I was hoping that they would end up being able to pick up the ball and go with the therapy. No one ever heard from the family that I know of, and I do not know what happened to that young man who was taking the estrogen that I prescribed. It was not a zone of comfort for me at all. So imagine my surprise when all of a sudden in 2007 and 8, I begin to see articles showing up in the standard pediatric journals about kids with transgender issues. It turns out that in 2006, Dr. Norman Spack from Boston, who's a pediatric endocrinologist, went to the Netherlands and decided he was infatuated with the idea that transgender treatments could be done to children. So he established his own transgender clinic in Boston after he came back from the Netherlands, and that was the first official transgender clinic in the United States. In 2009, the Endocrine Society, a major American medical group of academic endocrinologists, got together a working group of 10 individuals, all of whom were trans activists, none of whom had any contrary opinion, and they developed the guidelines for care of transgender persons. Now at that time, again, there was a Boston clinic and maybe a Los Angeles clinic. And so we had a very limited number of places to go, but the guidelines were very clear. Affirmation was the way to go once you evaluated the patient's psychological issues, and that you trained the family how to accept it and counsel the family. At the onset of puberty, you blocked puberty with hormone blockers, the GnRH agonists, and you could interrupt puberty and hold it, and then introduce cross-sex hormones within a couple of years, and transfer the physical appearance of the body to that of the opposite sex. And at the age of consent, 18, you could have, the patient could choose to have their genitalia removed or their breasts removed and other structures constructed to try to appear as if they were the opposite sex. These were the guidelines from the Endocrine Society. They were initially published to the membership for review. I sent in a strong protest. I don't know how many other people did, but I had my own clinical experience with Dr. Money, and I felt very strongly about it. And I got no feedback that my input was considered at all. And the guidelines were then published. Now, the guidelines are interesting. In the original 2009 guidelines, there were 22 recommendations. And in the world of science, there is a system called GRADE, G-R-A-D-E, and I can't remember what all the initials stand for, but it is a system to rate the scientific basis of the evidence on which the recommendations are made. One circle filled in indicates there is no scientific basis whatsoever. 2 circles colored in indicate that there is maybe a little bit of evidence, but is considerably weak. 3 circles indicate that there's a moderate amount of scientific evidence, and 4 circles indicates there is profoundly strong evidence in medical science and research to support the recommendations. Of these 22 recommendations, 3 had 3 circles, indicating moderately appropriate scientific background. All 3 of those recommendations were that there should be research done essentially on the effects, potentially, of cross-sex hormones and blocking puberty. The remaining 19 were split even between 0 evidence and scant, limited evidence of a basis for which the recommendations were made. So all of these were put forward by an endocrine society committee and published as a standard of care against, I mean, who knows how many of the members of the endocrine society, myself included, had a chance to have their opinions reviewed in contrast to what the recommendations were stated. But nonetheless, they were published, and from 2009 to 2014, the number of transgender clinics in the United States rose from 2 to 42. Now, did the incidence of transgenderism increase by that almost logarithmic type of advance? No. But the guidelines essentially set things up for academic institutions to create a clinic to conform to these new politically correct guidelines. And it was essentially unofficially stated that if you didn't go by those guidelines, you were a transphobe, and you were to be basically sent to the sidelines and shut up. So that did not settle well, but the transgender clinics flourished. And in 2017, these guidelines were revised. There were now 24 guidelines instead of 23. This time, only 4 had 3 circles, the same original ones, and an additional one that said that the patient should be counseled about the inevitable sterility that would happen due to this intervention. Kind of shocking. They lessened the emphasis on basic psychological evaluation. They lowered the age for cross-sex hormone recommendation and suggested that if the patient wanted to have earlier surgery than age 18, that could be considered maybe at age 16. So since those recommendations were published in 2017, we now have 55 transgender clinics in the United States. And this is any organization that is part of a children's health consortium at the university level vies for getting points to be the best children's hospital healthcare system. And one of the points you can get is if you have a transgender clinic that actively affirms patients. And they ask for numbers, and if you have the right numbers, you get extra points, and you rise in the ratings for the best children's hospital in the United States, and the US News and World Report annually. So this is a very perverse kind of situation where we are essentially using politics and social pressure and not basic science to look at the quality of medical care. So not to be outdone, the Pediatric Endocrine Society did its own set of guidelines. And if you look at the original Endo Society guidelines, the committee was made of 6 folks from the Netherlands and 4 folks from the United States. It was composed of 6 adult endocrinologists and 4 pediatric endocrinologists, making recommendations about pediatric endocrine issues. And we're talking about adult endocrinologists understanding puberty and growth and everything, which they never deal with clinically. They're always dealing with patients who are essentially fully mature. And they were the majority of the people on the committee that helped get these guidelines going. 2 of these individuals on that committee were former students of John Money. So, was there anybody on that committee, such as Dr. Paul McHugh, who understood everything and was widely respected? Nope. Was Dr. Kenneth Zucker on that committee? He wasn't an American, but he was excluded from that committee. So they carefully chose the guidelines and published what they wanted to. Now, not to be outdone even later than that, just this past September, last month, the American Academy of Pediatrics published guidelines for transgender care. They eliminated any reference to the need for psychological evaluation of the child. The only psychological issues were counseling the parents to accept their child's new gender, and that they had to do the counseling because the parents would otherwise be resistant, perhaps. They mentioned nothing at all about the medical concerns, and they basically spent time looking at government policy in terms of covering the insurance it needs for the children who needed puberty blockers, To do puberty blocking, we're talking in the United States about $20,000 per year of treatment, and it's not covered by insurance. So the lobby from the American Academy of Pediatrics, an organization of 66,000 pediatricians, pretty strong numbers, came up with these guidelines. Who wrote those guidelines? Did the 66,000 members of the American Academy of Pediatrics approve those and review them? No. A committee of individuals, 10 in number, and the executive board of 12, and some other individuals gathered together, a tiny fraction of the membership, wrote the guidelines and approved them without the membership knowing. Unwittingly, the membership looks at their parent organization and says, this is my professional organization. They say this is what it should be. I don't understand it, but clearly I don't have any training in this, therefore I will accept those guidelines and carry them on. So in the process of this whole burgeoning of transgender medicine, the incidence of true transgender or gender dysphoria rose in males from 0.06%, that is to say, 6 out of 100,000 males suffered from gender dysphoria, and 3 out of 100,000 females suffered. It now has been quoted, as of last week, that 1 out of 4 kids in high school has issues with transgenderism. So we've gone absolutely crazy. In the same process, there's a beautiful graph, which I meant to include and don't have it here, that shows the incidence of transgenderism over decades and the rise of transgenderism since the onset of Facebook, Instagram, and other social media on the internet. And what has happened is that the incidence, instead of being 2 to 1 male to female, is now 2 to 1 female to male. And that has happened because of social phenomenon and social contagion. Clearly not based on biology, but clearly based on sort of an hysterical, almost religious cult, if you will. So we have an issue then with politics trumping science, and that's where we are with transgenderism today. There are 3 areas that are of concern. One is the belief in transgenderism. It is literally as if it were a religion. It's not based on science, it's based on belief. Now, the world's religions are based on belief, and sometimes have some corroboration in science and history that's very, very important to those who believe. And those situations are not castigated. We don't cast aspersions on the fact because they have a particular religious belief. We allow them to believe that, but we do not allow them to go and have laws make us accept everything about them and change our lives to go along with their beliefs. So imagine if Roman Catholics decided to get a law which said, all of you in this room cannot eat fish on Fridays during Lent. That all of you in this room must go to confession at least once a year, and preferably more. You all must go to Mass on Sunday. And that if you don't, you are showing absolute ridicule and distrust and Roman Catholicophobia if you don't do that, okay? So, I mean, it's a parallel that no honest, sane person would ever believe is within the rights of individuals to be who they are and who they believe they are. So if a trans person wants to be trans and believes they're trans, we would suggest the kinds of therapy that we know do work, but we would not treat them as second-class citizens. We would not show them a lack of compassion. We would say to them, we understand that you are miserable and suffering deeply with what's going on, and we would hope that you would get some therapy. But please do not make me have to look at you naked in a men's room if you're a woman, or as a teenage boy in a female dressing room naked in that stage of life. That is an imposition on my individual rights, okay? And so I don't feel that the government should tell me that I have to do that. So it's basically the concept of it being foisted upon us as a state religion, if you will. Now, the medical societies have the guidelines, and I've already mentioned those, and the Diagnostic Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, has basically taken the concept of gender identity as a disorder and removed it as a disorder. And in some ways, that seems to make sense. And they wanted to cover the suffering that was going on and describe the suffering, so it became dysphoria instead of a disorder, because disorder is a very specific term in mental illness, that if you are persistent and having issues that cannot be changed, that are not real, that becomes essentially a delusional disorder. Before that, you have maybe some delusional thoughts or some thoughts that are not in touch with reality. So making everybody identified as a disorder when they are in transition of trying to figure out who they are on the gender scale should not be essentially placed as a negative term. So I agree with what happened, and that was very carefully thought out by the DSM. And Dr. Zucker actually chaired the committee that brought in the term gender dysphoria. So the third place that it happens, or second place that it happens in terms of political pressure trumping science, is in government regulation. As I alluded to for the gender bathroom bill in North Carolina, where it went all the way in the court system. It was stopped when the state legislature withdrew the bill for reasons that it was a non-issue. The state of North Carolina was castigated by major corporations who were activists that they would take all of their business out of the state and cause the state to fall on its knees financially unless they passed the bill that said the bathrooms can be visited by anybody of any gender just based on who they felt like. So there's pressure for local governments, there's pressure all the way down to school boards. The city of Decatur in Georgia, it's a suburb of Atlanta, passed a regulation without parental hearings that all bathrooms and all locker rooms were unisex. And that fell on its knees with a huge response from the parents who decided that was not the right thing to do. But the governments all the way down to the local level are putting these concepts into effect through regulations and laws. Another aspect of the politics trumping science is in academic medicine in terms of appointments of faculty and publications. So if you publish something that is essentially questions transgender as an innate biologic event and concept, then you will be removed from your faculty position if you're not tenured. And if you are tenured, you will be essentially not allowed to get grant money for the same reason. You will be left unpublished because the journals will not publish what you are trying to do. The most recent case of that was an article in the online journal, PLOS, by Dr. Lippman from Brown University, who described rapid onset gender dysphoria in females and interviewed 270 patients, parents, and families about how this occurred to basically show it was an internet-based hysteria phenomenon that caused this to happen in these girls. And it was withdrawn by Brown University, and Dr. Lippman was censured by the university for doing so within a week. So it drives other people, such as Dr. McHugh, who is a world expert, into publishing wherever he can. Dr. McHugh had written a long thesis that was beautifully referenced. It's kind of like eating really rich fudge. You cannot sit down and digest it all at once. You have to go back again and you kind of think about it, and then you go back again and read another section and digest it mentally, and you go back again, and it is a thorough evaluation of the lack of biology in same-sex attracted individuals and transgender patients. And he wrote this and referenced it, and then he said, I can't get this published, so I want to have somebody else who is an LGBT activist come and review this and point out to me all the places where I've shown personal bias or bias in any way that was not intended based on my religious faith. I want none of that in this paper. I want this all expunged. I want you to show me what in the world is wrong with this paper, because I know if I do it right, it could be published. So he enlisted Dr. Lawrence Mayer, a psychologist and a statistician and bioethicist, to review the paper. Dr. Mayer was an LGBT activist, very strongly feeling about the rights of individuals who had same-sex attraction and discrimination against them. And so he read the thing and he got into it and he said, oh my God, this is incredible. What you've done is you've unearthed the fact that 40% of same-sex attracted adults have severe or moderate depression. And no one is paying attention to this because it's not politically correct to bring that up. That would inherently mean that there was something that was an internal struggle with these individuals, and we just can't have that. So Dr. Mayer put his imprimatur, he actually became the lead author of this paper, put his name on it, wrote the introduction and sort of the executive summary. And within 1 week after it was published in a journal called The New Atlantis, a journal which is a sort of a quietly erudite journal that is not reviewed by a panel of peers, it was completely, totally lambasted in the medical press in the United States. There was a letter to the editor of a major newspaper signed by 600 medical professionals, so-called. It was a cut and paste list from WPATH. And within a week, they said, this is trash, this has no basis, this is absolutely hideous, this is a right-wing Catholic conservative psychiatrist who should be removed from Johns Hopkins as an emeritus professor and sent packing in shame. We will have none of this. That was published. I went through 10% of the list of authors of that letter, and it was not personally signed, it was just names on a list. And of that 10% that I looked at, and that was 60 names, I found one pediatric endocrinologist, several psychologists, and a bunch of names with no degrees after them. So these were the medical professionals, so-called, who said this paper was absolute trash. They obviously didn't read it, because when I read it, I got through in a week, maybe a third of it, and then I went back and I reread that again. Okay, so it's one of those things where it was an instant knee-jerk response, and everybody jumped on the train, and it made national news. And there was pressure from Johns Hopkins to actually remove Dr. McHugh from the emeritus faculty. They didn't do it, but they just kind of looked the other way. And in the meantime, they established their own transgender clinic at Johns Hopkins and advertised that proudly. So that's what we're facing here. We've got research studies that are designed to basically prove the point they want to make. So the transgender activists in our country got together in Seattle, a group that has a transgender clinic there, interviewed their trans-affirmed children, and they interviewed those that essentially from the families in their clinic that volunteered to be part of the interview process. Not every transgender patient, just those that had an interest in filling out the survey. And they found that 100% of these children were happy and well-adjusted at the end of the first year of affirmation. Now, who did the evaluations? Who filled out? The parents. This is no study that should be published. It means absolutely nothing. It's totally biased in terms of selection. It has no control group that was part of that to be interviewed, to compare. And yet it was published immediately in the journal Pediatrics, which is the voice of the American Academy of Pediatrics. So that gets published and then referred to over and over and over again over this past year as a valid scientific study that completely shows that affirmation of these children is the way to go. So beyond that, we are fighting a new study from NIH, which is National Institutes of Health, designed specifically to show essentially the same kind of results. This is experimentation on children without informed consent. These children do not know, were not told that they would be sterilized. And if they chose to be sterilized as children at age 12, 13, and 14, how many of them understand being a parent or procreating or raising a family in their future? Not very many of them. So that's the state of where we are. It's a dangerous situation. We want to fight the fight because it's important for us to continue to prove what we really believe, that we have to recapture the language using the concept of trans female, meaning a male who becomes a female, because you can't change sexes, you can change gender identity, should be a trans-identified male. And we should talk about sex maintenance therapy versus conversion therapy, because what are we converting? A biologic male into a biologic male? That's not conversion at all. That is essentially a concept of regaining who you really are biologically. We need to remove gender and replace it with the word sex on government documents. It's interesting that when I left, I just checked my driver's license in Georgia, and we're very enlightened in Georgia. We have sex, male or female, on the driver's license. Delta Airlines, on the situation where they want to know when you're traveling internationally, has gender. The form that I filled out to enter the UK had gender. So these kinds of things slip in and become valid as a concept when there really is no basis for that. And I'd like to close with the concept that nouns have gender and people have sex. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Van Meter, for that really excellent presentation. Let me say that I think that this is the most important meeting that has taken place in London today, if not way beyond London, that the challenge that Dr. Van Meter has just presented to us, that picture of what's occurring in the United States, is something that we know all too plainly here in the United Kingdom. We at the Christian Legal Centre have 2 live cases where in primary schools, young children aged 6 are identifying in the opposite gender. We have had these cases, and more cases in fact. We know of more cases, but parents get very scared. We've had more cases in this past year, but for the past year, a good 13 months or so, we have been looking for a medical professional who will give evidence in these cases. And we have been unable to identify a medical professional who will speak up. We've even had medical professionals in our office who have said, I cannot believe the silence of the profession. We are all in fear. We are all in fear. So when doctors are not affirming the biology because they live in fear of the political agenda, we are in a very difficult place. That's why this meeting today is the most important meeting in London. In fact, it's the most important meeting way beyond London. And it shows the importance of this launch today of the International Federation for Therapeutic and Counselling Choice. I am very honoured to be a trustee of this organisation. I pray that it goes from strength to strength. Today I want to thank particularly the very excellent line of speakers that we've had, Dr. Caris Mosley, Dr. Laura Hayes, David Pickup, Dr. Von Holt, and Dr. Van Meter. These are men and women who speak to the science, are unafraid to speak to the science, and need to keep on speaking to the science. This is an organisation which needs to exist across the globe because it is a global problem, it's a global issue, and it's not, and certainly in the United Kingdom, what we're seeing, and indeed we've heard from the States, is a ban on any therapy that actually speaks the scientific, the medical truth. We have a parliament just around the corner that is in denial of the truth, and even at this moment is consulting on gender identity through the consultation. So I want to thank Dr. Mike Davidson for this extraordinary endeavour, for conceiving of this with Crystal. Together they have been the driving force in setting this up today, against all the odds, against much difficulty. We have amongst us the evidence and the science and people that will speak it, but we know that it's being driven out again, also in the United Kingdom. Academic choice is being driven out, the case of Dr. James Caspian at Bath Spa University, and also Dr. Makareth, the doctor who lost his job because he said that he would refuse to say that a man was a woman and a woman was a man, and as a result of that, he lost his job. So the issues are live, they are real, we need to reappropriate the language. But today, it is to thank those that would stand and educate us and help us to do that. So that is our speakers today. To thank those who facilitate this day, so Lisa Nolan, the camera work that's going on. I'm hoping that this is being listened to across the nation and beyond. For all the practical details, the generosity, as always, of the Emmanuel Centre. There is much to do. We won't be silent. We will continue to speak the truth for the sake of truth, for the sake of our children, that more damage will not be done, because actually this is a matter of life and death. That's what it is. It's as serious as that. It's an attack on the truth, it's an attack on science, it's an attack on medicine, and it's an attack on innocent children. And we generally need, we just should be doing better, and the medical professionals should know better. So thank you very much for your time here. Thank you to everyone, and particularly to you, Dr. Davidson, for your courage. For always pressing on and actually doing extraordinary things. You are doing extraordinary things. So I know that this is now a question and answer session, and we look forward to that. Thank you.